The morning broke cold over the Montana ridgeline, the kind of cold that settles into old bones and refuses to leave. Colonel James Hartigan stood on the porch of his cabin, coffee steaming in a chipped mug that had survived 3 wars and 1 failed marriage. 68 years on this earth had taught him many things, but morning still belonged to the ghosts. The German shepherd at his feet lifted her gray muzzle. Gunny was 12 now, arthritic and half deaf, but her eyes still held the alertness of a century. They had that in common. Age might slow the body, but it couldn't quite kill the readiness, the constant scanning for threats that would probably never come. James took another sip and watched the sun climb over timber that had stood longer than any man's war. The cabin sat 20 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a dirt road that became impassable 6 months of the year. Most people called it isolation. He called it peace. Inside, the cabin held the sparse furnishings of a man who had learned not to get attached to things. A table, 2 chairs, a wood stove that heated the single room efficiently. Books on military history lined one wall, their spines cracked from repeated reading. On the mantel above the fireplace sat 3 photographs in simple frames. The first showed a young Army lieutenant, 31 years old, standing in front of a Huey helicopter somewhere in the mountain regions of Honduras. The uniform was crisp, the smile confident. Lieutenant David Hartigan, 1972. The man who had taught James to hunt, to shoot, to stand up straight and look the world in the eye. The man who had died when James was 14, leaving nothing but a folded flag and a letter that said he had perished in a training accident. Lies, all of it lies. But James had believed them for 54 years. The second photograph was harder to look at. Captain James Hartigan, USMC, age 32, holding his infant son outside Camp Pendleton. The year was 1990. He had just returned from the Gulf. His wife Sarah stood beside him, smiling despite the exhaustion new mothers wear like medals. They had named the boy David after the grandfather he would never meet. The third photograph sat in a black frame. Second Lieutenant David Hartigan Jr., age 21, Marine Force Recon, killed in action, Helmand Province, Afghanistan, 2011. The flag from that funeral was folded in a case beside it. James finished his coffee and turned back to the sunrise. Gunny whined softly, a sound that meant the mailman's truck was approaching, still a mile out but audible to ears sharper than his own. The truck appeared 15 minutes later, bouncing over ruts that would break a civilian vehicle's axle. Pete Sanderson had been delivering mail to these mountains for 30 years. He waved as he pulled up, his weathered face creasing into familiar lines. "Got something for you today, Colonel. Looks official." James descended the porch steps, his right knee complaining about the cold. Nothing was ever official anymore. He had been retired from the Marine Corps for 15 years. Pete handed him a package wrapped in brown paper. No return address, postmarked from a town James had never heard of. The weight felt wrong, too light for documents, too heavy for letters. "Have a good one, Colonel." The truck rumbled away, leaving silence in a package that felt like a bomb in James's hands. Inside, he set it on the table and studied it for a full minute before reaching for his pocket knife. The blade was older than Gunny, a K-bar his father had carried during classified operations in Central America. One of the few possessions returned with that folded flag. The paper fell away. Inside was a shoebox, the kind that had held combat boots decades ago. James lifted the lid. A cassette tape sat on top, the clear plastic case scratched and yellowed with age. Beneath it, a photograph. Black and white, grainy, the kind taken with a telephoto lens from a long distance. The image showed an old man, perhaps 80 or 85, sitting outside a wooden structure. Jungle vegetation framed the background. The man was thin, gaunt even, his hair white and thinning, but the bone structure of his face was unmistakable. James's hands began to shake. Beneath the photograph, a slip of paper with coordinates written in careful block letters. And beneath that, a small note card with a single word in faded ink. Protocol. He picked up the cassette tape with fingers that had stayed steady through firefights and ambushes but now trembled like leaves. The cabin had no cassette player. Nobody did anymore. But he kept one in the closet, an old boombox from the 80s that he had never quite thrown away. It took him 10 minutes to find it, buried under winter clothes and boxes of ammunition. Another 5 minutes to find batteries that still held a charge. He inserted the tape, pressed play, and heard the hiss of magnetic ribbon spinning across ancient heads. Then a voice, thin, weakened by age and illness, but unmistakable even after 54 years. "James, if you're hearing this, Then I'm either dead or about to be. I don't have much time, son. The sickness is in my lungs, in my blood. Agent Orange, they called it in the old wars. Chemical exposure from operations that officially never happened. Fitting, I suppose, poison from conflicts that ended before some of our grandchildren were born. A long pause, filled with the sound of labored breathing. I know what you were told. Training accident, 1973, clean death, honorable. Your mother believed it. You believed it. I needed you to believe it. Another pause. In this background, James could hear jungle sounds, birds, insects, the whisper of wind through heavy vegetation. The truth is, I didn't die in 73. I was captured during an assault on Forward Operating Base Delta in the Honduras mountain region. Your godfather, Raymond McKenna, was there. He saw them take me alive. I made him promise to report me killed in action. I didn't want your mother waiting forever for a man who wasn't coming home. James sank into the chair, his legs no longer able to support him. They broke me, son. Not with torture, though there was plenty of that. They broke me with time. 2 years in a concrete cell watching good men die from disease and despair. Soviet handlers who understood psychology better than pain. And then they offered me a choice. Work for them, provide intelligence, and live. Or rot in that cell until malaria or dysentery finished what the beating started. I was weak. I chose to live. The voice cracked, emotion bleeding through decades of distance. I've spent 50 years as an intelligence asset, Iron Pyramid, they called the program. Turn American POWs into permanent sources. I fed them information on troop movements, on CIA operations, on anything they wanted. I told myself I was preventing escalation, saving lives by helping them understand our limitations. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I was a traitor because I was afraid to die. Silence for several seconds, long enough that James thought the tape had ended. Now someone is killing us. The other pyramid assets. 4 dead in the last 6 months. Car accidents, heart attacks, falls that weren't accidents. I'm next. I can feel it. I'm calling into the protocol, son. Before FOB Delta was overrun, 6 of us made a pact. If any man ever went missing and sent the code word protocol, it meant he was coming home but needed help. Trust only each other's sons and the men who served beside us. Find Raymond McKenna. He's kept my secret for 54 years. He'll keep yours too. Find Samuel Washington. Find Thomas Kowalski. Find David Chen. They're old now, like me, but they remember. They know what protocol means. I have evidence, James. 50 years of files, names, operations. I was going to take it to my grave. But if I'm being killed, it means someone wants those files buried with me. Someone who's still operating. Someone who's still using the network we built. The coordinates on that paper will lead you to me. Come quickly. And son, I'm sorry I missed your life. Sorry I wasn't there when you joined the Corps, when you married Sarah, when you had your boy. I know about David. Know he died serving like I should have. I'm proud of him. Proud of you. But don't make the same mistake I did. Don't choose survival over truth. Whatever you find when you come, whatever I've become, promise me you'll get those files to someone clean. Someone who'll use them to burn this thing down. I'm sorry, James, for everything. I love you. I always have. The tape clicked off. James sat motionless for a long time. Gunny pressed against his leg, sensing distress in the way dogs do, offering the only comfort she could. Outside, the sun continued its arc across the Montana sky. Inside, a man's world had just collapsed and rebuilt itself in the space of 3 minutes. His father was alive, had been alive for 54 years. His father was a traitor, had sold his country for 50 years. His father was dying, was calling for help from a son who had buried him decades ago. James picked up the photograph again, studying the man's face with eyes trained to read terrain and threat. The image had been taken recently, within the last year, based on the vegetation and the man's appearance. The structure behind him looked like a dwelling, simple but maintained. The jungle suggested Southeast Asia, Laos perhaps, or northern Thailand. Remote, hidden. He turned to the coordinates. They meant nothing without context, but any computer could translate numbers into location. The question wasn't where. The question was whether. Whether to go, whether to believe. Whether 54 years of grief and memory could be overturned by a voice on a cassette tape. James stood and walked to the mantel. He picked up the photograph of his father in his dress blues, young and vital and doomed. Then he picked up the photograph of his son, also young, also vital, also lost to war. 3 generations of Hartigan men, 3 different wars, 2 dead, 1 still breathing. Or maybe not 2 dead, maybe only 1. He set the photographs down and reached for his phone. The number he dialed from memory, though he hadn't called it in 6 months. It rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered, rough with age and cigarettes. This is McKenna. Raymond, it's James Hartigan. Silence on the line, the kind that speaks louder than words. Hawk, hell of a surprise. What's going on? I need to see you, today. It's about David. Another pause, longer this time. Which David? My father. The silence stretched 10 seconds, 15. When Raymond McKenna spoke again, his voice had changed, hardened into something James recognized from their deployments together in the Gulf. I'm in Wyoming, 6-hour drive from you. Come alone. James hung up and looked at Gunny. The dog watched him with liquid brown eyes, patient and knowing. Road trip, girl. He packed light. A duffel bag with clothes, toiletries, the cassette tape, the photograph, and the coordinates. From the gun safe, he took his father's K-bar knife and his own M1911 pistol, the one he had carried through 2 deployments. 45 caliber, 7 rounds, built before he was born, and still firing true. Some tools didn't need replacing. The drive to Wyoming took him through mountain passes where snow still clung to north-facing slopes despite the approach of summer. He stopped once for gas and coffee, eating a sandwich he didn't taste while Gunny stretched her legs and sniffed at unfamiliar territory. Raymond McKenna's house sat at the end of a dirt road outside Jackson Hole, a small ranch property with a barn that had seen better decades and fences that needed mending. The property backed against public land, thousands of acres where a man could hunt and fish and pretend civilization didn't exist just 20 miles down the highway. An old Ford pickup sat in the driveway. As James pulled up beside it, the front door opened and Raymond stepped onto the porch. 71 years had bent him slightly, but not broken him. He stood well over 6 feet, shoulders still broad despite the stoop age brings to tall men. His hair was white, cut in a military flat top that never went out of style because it had never been in style. His face was weathered leather, creased by decades of sun and wind and cigarettes. But his eyes were the same, sharp, evaluating. The eyes of a man who had seen combat and survived by never stopping his assessment of threat and terrain. Hawk, Doc. They had called him Doc since boot camp, though Raymond McKenna had never been a corpsman. The nickname came from his ability to diagnose problems, mechanical or tactical or personal, with the kind of clarity that made solutions obvious. He had saved James's life twice in the Gulf, once by pulling him from a burning vehicle, and once by talking him out of a dark place after they lost 4 men to friendly fire. Raymond descended the porch steps and they embraced, the brief, hard contact of men who had shared foxholes and understood what words couldn't convey. Come inside, coffee's on. The interior of the house matched the exterior, functional, sparse, organized with military precision. Photographs on the walls showed Raymond through the decades. Central America in the early 70s, young and lean. The Gulf in 91, older but still hard. Iraq in 03, graying but unbroken. And more recent images showing a young woman, perhaps 16, with Raymond's eyes and her mother's smile. Your granddaughter? Sarah, named after your wife. She's visiting her mother in California this week. Probably good she's not here for this conversation. Raymond poured coffee into 2 mugs and sat at the kitchen table. James took the chair across from him, the one that faced the door. Old habits. You said it was about David. I assume you mean your father, not your son. James pulled the cassette tape from his jacket and set it on the table between them. Then the photograph. Then the slip with coordinates. Raymond looked at the items without touching them. His face showed nothing, but his hands tightened around the coffee mug. Where did you get this? Mail, this morning, no return address. Raymond finally reached for the photograph. He studied it for a long time, his jaw working like he was chewing words he couldn't quite spit out. How much did the tape tell you? That my father didn't die in 73. That you were there when he was captured. That you lied in your after-action report. Raymond set the photograph down carefully as if it might shatter. He made me promise. FOB Delta was being overrun. We were pulling back and David stayed with the rear guard. 4 of us held that position. David, myself, and 2 corporals named Briggs and Martinez. We held for 20 minutes, long enough for the main force to break contact. Raymond's voice had fallen into the cadence of after-action reports, flat and factual, the only way some memories could be spoken. Briggs took a round through the throat, dead before he hit the ground. Martinez lost both legs to a grenade. I was trying to stop the bleeding when the enemy forces swarmed the position. They came over the berm like ants. David put himself between them and us, killed 3 with his rifle, 2 more with his sidearm. Then they were on him. He paused to drink coffee, though his hand shook slightly. I saw them drag him away. He was alive, bleeding but alive. Martinez died while I watched. I was the only one left. I crawled into the jungle and hid for 6 hours before a helicopter extracted me. And the report? David had made me promise months earlier. He said if he ever got captured, I was to report him killed in action. He didn't want his wife, your mother, waiting forever. Didn't want you growing up wondering. He wanted you to have closure, even if it was a lie. So you lied. I lied. Filed a report that said all 4 of us died in the base assault. David's body was never recovered, which wasn't uncommon. The jungle swallowed everything. They declared him killed in action, sent your mother a flag, and closed the file. Raymond looked directly at James for the first time since they sat down. I've lived with that lie for 54 years, Hawk. Carried it through 3 more wars. Every time I saw your mother at a reunion, every time I saw you in your uniform, I carried it. Part of me died at Phobie Delta 2, just slower than Briggs or Martinez. James felt anger rising, hot and familiar. But he forced it down. Anger was easy. Understanding was harder. The tape mentioned a protocol, Iron Pyramid Protocol. Raymond nodded slowly. Before Phobie Delta, your father and 5 other officers created it. They were all working intelligence operations in different capacities during the Cold War conflicts. They knew the risks of capture, of going dark. So they made a pact. If any man ever went missing and managed to send the code word protocol, it meant he was alive and needed extraction. The protocol was simple. Trust only each other's sons and the men who served directly beside them. Who were the others? Samuel Washington. He was an Air Force pilot running supply missions into contested zones. Got shot down in '73 and spent 2 years as a POW in a Soviet-controlled facility. We pulled him out in '75 during diplomatic exchanges. Thomas Kowalski, Navy SEAL, ran operations in Central America. Lost his leg in Beirut in '83. David Chen, Army Intelligence, Cryptanalysis and Signals. He was attached to our unit for 3 months in '72. 2 others died in their bodies in '90s. Natural causes, as far as I know. And my father kept working for them for 50 years. Raymond reached into a drawer and pulled out a small notebook, the kind soldiers used to carry for field notes. The cover was stained and worn. He slid it across the table. After the conflicts ended, I tried to find him. Used every contact I had, called in every favor. In '82, I got a lead. A source in Bangkok said an American was working as an intelligence broker in the Golden Triangle. I flew there on my own dime. Found him in a village outside Chiang Mai. What did he say? Raymond's eyes grew distant. He said he couldn't come home. Said he had done things, given them things, that made him a traitor under any definition that mattered. Said if he came back, he'd face prison or worse. But he also said he was trying to do good with bad circumstances, feeding information to multiple sides, playing them against each other to prevent escalations. He believed he was saving lives. Did you believe him? I wanted to. Your father was a good man, Hawk, the best officer I ever served under. But war breaks people in ways you can't predict. He broke differently than most, not into pieces, but into something else, something harder to define. James picked up the notebook and flipped through pages of Raymond's cramped handwriting. Dates, locations, brief observations. A 50-year investigation into a man officially dead. The tape said someone is killing the pyramid assets. Raymond nodded. I've been tracking that too. 4 deaths in 6 months. All men who were listed as POW or MIA between '72 and '75. All died of apparent accidents or natural causes. But the timing is too clean. Someone is cleaning house. Why now? Why after 50 years? That's what we need to find out. But first, we need to decide if we're going to Laos. James looked at the coordinates again. He's my father. He's also a traitor. You need to be clear about that before we start this. Whatever we find, whatever files he has, they could destroy careers, maybe destabilize intelligence operations that are keeping people safe right now. Or they could expose 50 years of illegal black operations. Raymond smiled without humor. Probably both. That's the thing about secrets, Hawk. They're secret for a reason, and that reason is usually because the truth is complicated. I need to see him, even if he is a traitor, even if it destroys everything. He's calling in a protocol that you all swore to honor. Are you in or out? Raymond stood and walked to a closet. He returned with a go bag, already packed, the kind soldiers keep ready for deployments that come without warning. I've been in since I made that promise at FOB Delta. Let's go get the others. They drove to Wyoming first, to Samuel Washington's ranch outside Sheridan. The property spread across 200 acres of grassland and timber, with mountains rising in the distance like sentinels. A small airstrip ran along the southern boundary, grass and gravel, long enough for the Cessna parked in an open hangar. Samuel Washington stood beside the aircraft when they arrived, wiping oil from his hands with a red rag. At 73, he moved with the deliberate care of a man who understood his body's limitations but refused to accept them. He was African American, his close-cropped white hair contrasting sharply with dark skin weathered by decades of sun. He wore jeans and a denim shirt, but his posture remained military straight. Raymond made introductions that weren't needed. Samuel and James had met before, at reunions and memorials, though they had never served together. "Heard you were coming," Raymond called ahead. Samuel led them to a workshop behind the main house. Inside, the space was immaculate. Tools hung on pegboards in precise arrangements. A workbench held a disassembled aircraft engine. But what caught James's attention was the wall covered in maps. Not modern printed maps, but hand-drawn tactical maps, the kind officers made before GPS and satellite imagery. Samuel gestured to a chair. "Before we talk about why you're here, I need to tell you something about FOB Delta that Raymond probably didn't mention." James sat. Samuel remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a parade rest that looked more natural than casual posture. "I was flying supply runs to Delta in the weeks before it fell. Your father and I became friends. He talked about you constantly, showed me pictures, told me about teaching you to shoot, about the hunting trips you took in Montana. He loved you more than anything in this world." Samuel's voice carried the measured cadence of a man who had spent years in command. 2 days before the base was overrun, I flew David out for a briefing at headquarters. On the flight back, he told me about the protocol, said if he ever went dark, if he ever sent that code word, I was to help bring him home. I gave him my word. And did you try? I was shot down 3 weeks after FOB Delta, spent 2 years in Soviet detention. When they released me in 75 through prisoner exchanges, the conflicts were winding down. I tried to find him, same as Raymond, got the same leads. Bangkok, Chiang Mai, Laos. I even flew over the coordinates you're carrying. Back in 93, saw the compound from the air, but I couldn't land, couldn't make contact. The political situation was too unstable. Why didn't you tell me? Samuel met his eyes. Because you were 14 when your father died, then 18, then 25. At what point do you tell a man that his father, his hero, defected to the enemy? That the funeral was empty theater? I made a choice to let you keep your memory of him clean. Maybe that was wrong. James felt the weight of decades pressing down. 2 men, both carrying the same secret, both protecting him from a truth they thought would destroy him. He's dying. Chemical exposure from old operations. The tape said he has maybe 3 months. Samuel nodded slowly. Then we don't have time for long discussions. You want to go to Laos, bring him home, and get those files he mentioned. I'm assuming Raymond is already in. Question is whether we bring Thomas and David into this. We need them. Thomas for tactics, David for intelligence analysis. This is bigger than a simple extraction. Samuel walked to a desk and pulled out a satellite phone, the kind used by people who operated beyond normal communication networks. I'll call them. We meet here tomorrow morning. If we're doing this, we do it right. That night, James lay awake in the guest room of Samuel's ranch house. Staring at ceiling beams he couldn't see in the darkness. Gunny snored softly on the floor beside the bed, content in the way only dogs can be, living purely in the present without the burden of past or anxiety about future. James envied her that. His mind circled the same questions like a bird of prey, searching for prey it couldn't quite see. What if his father was lying? What if this was a trap? What if the man on that tape was broken beyond recognition, kept alive only by habit and regret? And underneath those questions, one that cut deeper. What if he found his father and couldn't forgive him? Forgiveness was supposed to be noble, the mark of an evolved soul. But James had spent 68 years believing his father died heroically. He had built his own service on that foundation, joined the Marines because of that folded flag, pushed his son toward military service because the Hartigan men served. And now the foundation was cracked, maybe shattered, and he didn't know if the structure built on top of it could survive. Outside, an owl called across the grassland. Another answered, and then silence returned. James closed his eyes and tried to picture his father as he remembered him. Strong hands teaching a boy to field dress a deer. Patient voice explaining trajectory and windage. Proud smile at a high school graduation. All memories from before the classified operations, before FOB Delta, before everything went wrong. But the memories felt thinner now, like photographs left too long in sunlight, fading to white spaces and vague shapes. Morning came cold and clear. Samuel had coffee ready and breakfast cooking when James entered the kitchen. Raymond sat at the table studying maps spread across the surface. He looked up when James entered. David Chen arrives at 0900. Thomas is driving from Montana, should be here by noon. Samuel flipped eggs with practiced efficiency. I've been thinking about logistics. We can't exactly fly commercial to Laos and hike into the jungle. We need a cover story, documentation, and a way to extract quickly if things go sideways. I still have contacts in Thailand from old operations. Men who run legitimate businesses but remember the old networks. We can stage from there. Raymond tapped the map. The coordinates put us here. 40 clicks inside Laos from the Thai border. Golden Triangle territory. Used to be controlled by warlords and opium farmers. Now it's a mix of Chinese intelligence, drug syndicates, and private military contractors. We're going to need more than good intentions. We'll need weapons, local guides we can trust, and a damn good exit strategy. The conversation continued through breakfast, mixing tactical planning with reminiscence, the way old soldiers do, unable to separate past from present because the two bleed together in memory. At precisely 0900, a late-model sedan pulled up the drive. The man who emerged moved carefully, as if his body was an instrument requiring deliberate operation. David Chen was 67 but looked older, his face carrying the weight of more than age. Raymond made introductions. Chen's handshake was firm, despite the tremor in his fingers. I brought what you asked for. He opened the trunk to reveal 2 hard cases and a laptop. Inside the first case was communication equipment, compact and modern. The second held surveillance gear, small cameras and listening devices that looked like ordinary objects. Chen set up the laptop on Samuel's kitchen table and began typing with the speed of a man who had spent decades making computers obey. I pulled everything I could find on Iron Pyramid without triggering alerts. It's not much. The program was buried deep, multiple classification levels, compartmentalized beyond normal protocols. What did you find? Chen turned the laptop so they could see the screen. A document filled with redacted text, black bars covering most of the content. Iron Pyramid started in 1975 as a POW recovery operation. But that was cover. The real program was recruitment. They identified prisoners who might be turned, either through psychological pressure or by offering them better treatment in exchange for cooperation. Once turned, these assets were released back into operational zones, where they continued working for various intelligence agencies. So my father was part of a sanctioned program? Initially, yes, but the program was shut down officially in 1982 after congressional investigations. However, the assets remained active. They had become too valuable to simply recall, so someone kept running them off the books. Who? Chen pulled up another document, this one a series of names and dates. I can't prove it, but the timeline suggests someone high up in CIA and later in the intelligence community overall. Someone who survived multiple administrations and maintained access to black budgets. Raymond leaned closer to the screen. Senator Harrison Vance. He was junior CIA in the 70s, rose through the ranks, transitioned to political office in the 90s. He's been on the Senate Intelligence Committee for 20 years. Chen nodded. Vance has made a career of exposing and reforming intelligence programs. But every program he shuts down publicly seems to migrate into darker channels. He's either incredibly unlucky or incredibly clever. Or both, Samuel added. The best way to control a network is to be the one investigating it. Before they could continue, the sound of a diesel engine announced another arrival. Thomas Kowalski's pickup truck was 40 years old and looked older, rust eating through the wheel wells, but it ran with the reliability of equipment maintained by someone who understood machinery. Thomas himself was 69, built like a barrel with arms. his shoulders still broad despite the stoop of age. He walked with a pronounced limp, his left leg a prosthetic from knee down. But he moved with the confidence of a man who had long ago stopped seeing his disability as a limitation. Heard you boys were planning something stupid. Couldn't let you have all the fun. The reunion took another hour, 5 old soldiers and 1 younger one, swapping stories and insults, in the way men do when they're deciding whether to trust their lives to each other again. Finally, Samuel called the meeting to order with the quiet authority that had made him an effective commander. All right, let's be clear about what we're doing. James's father is alive, probably dying, definitely in possession of evidence that could expose 50 years of illegal intelligence operations. Someone is killing the other pyramid assets. We're going to Laos to extract David Hartigan and secure those files. Anyone who wants out, now's the time to say so. Nobody moved. Thomas spoke first. I lost my leg in Beirut because someone up the chain made a decision based on faulty intelligence. If David's files show who's been making those kinds of decisions for 5 decades, I want to see them burn. I'm in. David Chen adjusted his glasses. My wife has Alzheimer's. She doesn't always remember me anymore, but she remembers the old conflicts. She remembers the fear, the case, the betrayals. If we can prevent another generation from living through that kind of deception, I'm in. Raymond just nodded. His commitment was decades old. Samuel looked at James. This is your call, son, your father, your choice. But once we start, we finish, no matter what we find. James thought about the cassette. His father's voice weakened by age and sickness, but still recognizable. Thought about 54 years of lies and grief and a folded flag that had meant everything and nothing. Thought about his own son, buried at 21 because men in offices made decisions that turned into body bags. We go, we bring him home, and we burn it all down. Samuel smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Then let's plan an extraction. They worked through the day and into the evening, mapping routes and contingencies, identifying equipment they would need and contacts who might provide it. Samuel made calls on his satellite phone to men in Bangkok and Chiang Mai, old contacts who had stayed in Southeast Asia after the Cold War conflicts and built legitimate businesses that could provide cover. Thomas assembled a list of weapons they could acquire once in country. Nothing high-tech, nothing that would draw attention. Reliable rifles, sidearms, basic equipment for jungle operations. David Chen created false documentation, passports and visas, and business licenses that would hold up to cursory inspection. He also began mapping the digital footprint they would leave, creating diversions and dead ends. Raymond focused on medical supplies and emergency protocols. He had seen enough men die from preventable causes to know that survival often came down to preparation. And James studied the photograph of his father trying to reconcile the young lieutenant in dress blues with the gaunt old man in the jungle. They were the same person separated by 50 years and choices that had bent one life into another. As night fell over Wyoming grassland, 6 men sat around Samuel's kitchen table and shared a meal. Nobody spoke about the dangers ahead or the possibility that some of them might not return. That kind of talk was for people who didn't understand war. Instead, they talked about children and grandchildren, about fishing trips in the mountains they loved, about the America they had served and the one they hoped still existed beneath layers of bureaucracy and political theater. And when the meal was finished and the dishes were cleared, they stood together in Samuel's workshop and looked at the maps one final time. Raymond broke the silence. Tomorrow we start the journey, but tonight I want to say something. We're old men chasing ghosts from conflicts that ended before some of our grandchildren were born. The smart move is to let it go, to let David die with his secrets. But we didn't become Marines and soldiers and airmen because we made smart moves. We did it because we believed in something bigger than ourselves. That belief might have been naive, might have been manipulated by men like Vance, but it was real, and it's still real. He looked at each man in turn. Whatever we find in Laos, whatever David has become, we keep our promise. We bring him home, and we make sure his last act counts for something. Agreed? 5 voices answered as one. Agreed. Outside, stars emerged in a sky untouched by city lights. The mountains stood silent and eternal, witnesses to plans made by men who understood their mortality but refused to let it define their actions. James stood on the porch long after the others had gone to bed. Gunny sat beside him, her warmth a comfort against the cooling night. Tomorrow would begin a journey that might end in betrayal or redemption, or simply more questions. But tonight he had something he hadn't possessed in decades. Purpose. His father was alive. The man who had taught him to shoot, to stand tall, to face the world with courage. The man who had also betrayed everything those lessons implied. Both truths could exist simultaneously, contradicting and complementing, the way all human truths do. James pulled out his phone and looked at the last message from his wife, Sarah, sent 3 years before cancer took her. "Come home safe. I'll be waiting." She had always been waiting, through deployments and training exercises and all the times duty took him away from her. And when his son died, she had held James together when everything else fell apart. Then she had gotten sick, and he had tried to do the same for her. But cancer doesn't respect devotion. Now he was alone except for an old beau and older friends and a father who might be more ghost than man. But he wasn't afraid. Fear had burned out of him somewhere between his son's funeral and his wife's bedside. What remained was simpler, the need to finish what had been started 54 years ago at a forward base in Central America. James looked up at the stars, the same stars that hung over Laos, over Phoebe Delta, over Arlington National Cemetery where his son rested beneath marble and grass. "I'm coming, Dad, and when I find you, we're going to settle accounts." The mountains offered no answer, but then they never did. Mountains just stood and waited, patient as stone, while men made their plans and the world turned beneath uncaring stars. Inside the ranch house, 5 old soldiers slept with the practiced ease of men who had learned to rest when rest was possible. Tomorrow would bring planning and preparation. The day after, they would begin the journey toward truth or consequences, or most likely both. But tonight, in Wyoming darkness, they were simply men who had made a promise and intended to keep it, regardless of cost. Because that's what protocol meant. Not a set of rules or procedures, but a commitment that transcended time and circumstance. A promise made by young men in jungle and mountains half a century ago, still binding on old men who refused to forget what honor meant. The last lights in the ranch house went dark. Silence settled over grassland and timber. And somewhere in the Laotian jungle, an old man waited for sons and brothers to keep a promise made when the world was different, but the bonds were eternal. The protocol had been called. The protocol would be answered. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The C-130 cargo plane rattled through turbulence over the Pacific, its aluminum skin flexing and groaning like an old man's joints. James Hartigan sat in the web seating along the fuselage wall, surrounded by crates labeled as agricultural equipment bound for Thailand. The noise made conversation impossible, which suited him fine. Some thoughts needed silence. Across from him, Raymond McKenna dozed with the practiced ease of a soldier who had learned to sleep anywhere, anytime. His white hair was pressed flat against the bulkhead, his weathered hands folded across his chest. 71 years old and still able to fall asleep in a cargo plane flying through a storm. Some skills never faded. Thomas Kowalski sat nearby, his prosthetic legs stretched out in front of him. He was reading a paperback western, the kind with a faded cover showing a gunfighter on a dusty street. Every few minutes he would look up, scan the interior of the aircraft with eyes that still searched for threats, then return to his book. Combat awareness was permanent, embedded in the nervous system like muscle memory. David Chen worked on a laptop secured to a fold-down table, his face illuminated by the screen's pale glow. Even at 30,000 feet over international waters, he was tracking communication patterns, monitoring signals, searching for the digital footprints that revealed what official channels concealed. He had warned them that someone would be watching, that their movements would trigger alerts in systems most people didn't know existed. Samuel Washington sat beside the pilot, visible through the open cockpit door. He was talking to the aircraft commander, probably discussing flight paths and weather patterns, using the technical language of men who understood how aluminum and engines and physics kept tons of metal airborne. At 73, Samuel still held a commercial pilot's license and flew his Cessna across Wyoming skies whenever arthritis and weather permitted. The loadmaster, an Air Force tech sergeant young enough to be their grandson, made his way down the fuselage checking cargo straps. He stopped beside James and leaned close to be heard over the engine noise. "Colonel, we'll be landing in Bangkok in 4 hours. Customs has been arranged. You'll clear as agricultural consultants exactly like your documentation states." James nodded. The cover story was simple enough to be believable. 6 American men consulting on sustainable farming practices in Southeast Asia. Nobody would look too closely at retirees on what appeared to be a charity mission. The sergeant moved on, and James returned to watching the cargo netting shift with the aircraft's movements. Somewhere beneath them, thousands of miles of dark ocean rolled in swells that had been moving since before humans built boats to cross them. The Pacific had swallowed men and ships and aircraft for centuries, indifferent to ambition and planning. It would swallow them too if the engines failed, or the weather turned worse, or any of 1,000 variables shifted wrong. But James had stopped worrying about death somewhere between his son's funeral and his wife's final breath. What scared him now was failure. The possibility of flying halfway around the world only to find his father already dead, or worse, so broken by time and sickness that nothing recognizable remained. He closed his eyes and let the engine vibrations settle into his bones. Behind his eyelids, memory played scenes he hadn't revisited in years. His father teaching him to track deer through Montana snow, reading signs in disturbed leaves and broken twigs. His father showing him how to clean a rifle, the smell of gun oil and the click of parts fitting together. His father's hand on his shoulder at his high school graduation, pride evident in the grip. All of it real. All of it also built on a foundation that had cracked the moment James played that cassette tape. The aircraft banked slightly, adjusting course. James opened his eyes and found Raymond watching him from across the fuselage. The older man's expression carried understanding that needed no words. He had carried the same burden for 54 years. The knowledge that every memory of David Hartigan was both true and false simultaneously. Raymond leaned forward, raising his voice enough to cut through the engine noise. Whatever we find, Hawk, remember he was still your father. What happened after doesn't erase what came before. James wanted to believe that, needed to believe it, but belief and truth didn't always align. The landing in Bangkok came with dawn breaking over the city, the sky shifting from black to gray to gold as the C-130 descended toward Don Mueang Royal Thai Air Force Base. The wheels touched concrete with a chirp of rubber, and the aircraft rolled to a stop near a cluster of civilian hangars at the far end of the field. Customs consisted of a board official who barely glanced at their passports before stamping them. The agricultural equipment story held. They collected their bags, which contained clothes and camping gear, and nothing that would raise questions, and walked into tropical heat that hit like a physical weight. Yvonne waited outside the terminal, white and unmarked, except for magnetic signs advertising a farm supply company. The driver was Thai, perhaps 50, with the compact build and alert eyes of someone who had seen combat. He nodded to Samuel. General Washington, long time. Samuel shook his hand. Somchai. Good to see you. These are the men I told you about. Somchai studied each of them in turn, his gaze lingering on the way they stood, the way they scanned surroundings, the subtle markers that separated civilians from soldiers. You are all military. Good. Amateurs die in the jungle. Get in. The drive through Bangkok took 2 hours, navigating traffic that defied any rules James understood. Motorcycles weaved between cars with inches to spare. Buses lurched to stops that sent pedestrians scattering. The city smelled of exhaust and cooking food, and humanity pressed together in numbers that made even New York seem sparse. Somchai navigated it all with calm efficiency, occasionally pointing out landmarks or offering observations about the city's evolution since the old conflicts. He had flown helicopters for covert operations, the kind that officially didn't exist. After the Cold War ended, he had stayed in Thailand and built a logistics company that moved legal cargo and occasionally other things for people who paid well and asked few questions. We stayed tonight in Safe House, he said as they left the city behind and entered countryside where rice paddies stretched to the horizon. Tomorrow we cross into Laos. The border is not difficult if you know the right people. I know the right people. What about weapons? Thomas asked from the back of the van. Somchai smiled without taking his eyes from the road. Tonight, after dark. I have what you need, not American, not new, but reliable. AK-47s, some pistols, ammunition, enough for 6 men who know how to shoot. The safe house turned out to be a compound outside a small town whose name James didn't catch. High walls surrounded a main building and 2 outstructures. The gates were solid steel. Cameras mounted at intervals provided overlapping coverage. This wasn't just a house, it was a fortress pretending to be civilian. Inside, the main room held a table, chairs, sleeping mats rolled against one wall, and a kitchenette with a refrigerator humming in the corner. The windows were barred, the doors were reinforced. Somchai had prepared for guests who might need to defend themselves. Rest now, he said, Tonight we plan, tomorrow we move. The afternoon passed in a haze of heat and exhaustion. James tried to sleep but couldn't. His mind kept circling back to the coordinates, to what they might find, to whether his father would even be alive when they arrived. Raymond sat outside in the shade, cleaning weapons that hadn't been fired yet, with the methodical attention of a man for whom maintenance was meditation. David Chen established a communications center on the table, linking his laptop to satellite internet and monitoring channels that would alert them if anyone took unusual interest in their presence. He worked in silence, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the precision of a concert pianist. Thomas inspected his prosthetic leg, checking the connections and hydraulics that let him walk. Modern prosthetics were marvels of engineering, but they still required care. He had worn artificial legs for 41 years, long enough that he sometimes forgot which one was real until phantom pain reminded him. Samuel sat with Somchai, looking at maps and satellite images, tracing routes from the Thai border to the coordinates in Laos. The terrain was mountainous, heavily forested, home to villages that existed outside government control. It was the kind of place where a man could hide for 50 years if he knew how. As sunset painted the sky orange and purple, Somchai brought food: rice, grilled chicken, vegetables, and fish sauce. They ate together, 6 Americans and 1 Thai, sharing a meal that tasted of foreign spices and familiar companionship. After dinner, Somchai opened a storage room and revealed the weapons: 5 AK-47 rifles, well-maintained despite their age, 4 pistols, a mix of Browning high powers and surplus military sidearms, ammunition in sealed cans, basic load-bearing equipment, Chinese knockoffs of American tactical gear, but functional. Thomas picked up one of the AKs and performed a function check with practiced efficiency. The weapon was clean, the action smooth. He nodded approval. These will do. They spent 2 hours checking equipment, loading magazines, distributing ammunition. James hadn't held an AK-47 since the Gulf, but the muscle memory returned quickly. The weapon was heavier than an M16, cruder in construction, but undeniably reliable. Kalashnikov had designed it for conscripts and guerrillas, for people who needed something that would fire after being dragged through mud and sand. Raymond handled the weapons with the reverence of a man who understood that tools had purposes and anything used for killing deserved respect. He distributed ammunition carefully, ensuring each man carried enough, but not so much that weight would slow them. David Chen declined a rifle but accepted a pistol, a Browning high power that he checked and holstered with the awkward movements of someone who had qualified with firearms, but never loved them. His weapons were digital, invisible, delivered through networks most people didn't know existed. When the weapons were distributed and gear was organized, Somchai spread a map across the table. The coordinates David Hartigan had sent put them 40 kilometers inside Laos, in an area marked as restricted. This region is controlled by no one and everyone, Somchai explained, his finger tracing the border. The government in Vientiane claims it, but they do not enforce. Chinese intelligence operates here. Drug cartels, private security companies. Everyone pretends the others do not exist as long as territory is respected. How do we get in without starting a war? Samuel asked. We go quietly. Small group, local guides, move at night. I have contacts in the villages. They will guide you for money and because they remember the old operations. Many of them work for American forces. They have long memories for people who kept promises. An extraction, James asked. Once we have my father in the files, how do we get out? Somchai's expression grew serious. That is the difficult part. Going in, you are 6 old men hiking. Coming out, you may have injured, sick man who cannot walk. You may have people chasing you. I have helicopters standing by, old Huey I keep for special jobs. But it can only land in certain places, and those places are known to everyone who operates in the area. Once you call for pickup, you have maybe 30 minutes before others arrive. Then we move fast, Thomas said. Get in, get him, get out. Simple. Raymond shook his head. Nothing is simple 40 clicks inside hostile territory. We need contingencies, rally points, alternate routes, a plan for if things go wrong. They worked late into the night, mapping routes and identifying waypoints, discussing scenarios and responses. It was planning shaped by decades of experience, the kind of preparation that looked paranoid to civilians but had kept soldiers alive in places where hesitation meant death. Finally, near midnight, Samuel called a halt. We're as ready as we're going to be. Get some sleep. We cross at first light. James lay on a sleeping mat in the corner, staring at the ceiling fan that turned slowly overhead, pushing humid air in circles that provided illusion more than relief. Around him, the others settled into their own attempts at rest. Raymond's breathing deepened into sleep within minutes. Thomas shifted occasionally, probably dealing with phantom pain in the leg he no longer had. David Chen's laptop glowed softly as he continued monitoring invisible threats. James pulled out his phone and scrolled through old photographs. His wife, Sarah, smiling on their wedding day, young and beautiful and full of hope for a future that had delivered joy and sorrow in equal measure. His son, David, holding up a fish he had caught at age 8, pride evident in his gap-toothed grin. His father in dress blues, the photograph taken before the classified operations, before everything changed. 3 people who had shaped his life. 2 dead, 1 maybe dying in a jungle 40 kilometers from where he now lay unable to sleep. He put the phone away and closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come, but something like rest did, a state between waking and dreaming where memory and anticipation blurred together. Dawn arrived with roosters crowing and the smell of coffee brewing. Somchai had prepared breakfast, simple but filling, and they ate quickly while rechecking gear one final time. The mood had shifted from the previous night's planning session to something quieter, more focused. They were committed now. The only direction was forward. The van took them north, deeper into countryside where villages grew smaller and more scattered. After 3 hours, they turned onto a dirt road that wound through hills covered in dense vegetation. The road ended at a village of perhaps 20 structures, wood and corrugated metal, chickens scratching in the dirt. 2 men waited outside the largest building. Both were Thai, both in their 60s, both carrying themselves with the erect posture of former military. Somchai made introductions in Thai, then translated. Fong and Keat, they were scouts during the old conflicts. They know the border better than anyone. They will guide you to the coordinates and back. They do not speak English, but they understand tactics. Trust them. The group transferred gear to 2 pickup trucks that looked like they might fall apart but started reliably. Fong drove the lead vehicle with Samuel navigating. Kiat took the second truck with James, Raymond, Thomas, and David Chen crowded into the bed with the equipment. The drive took another 2 hours on roads that became progressively worse, eventually degrading to tracks barely wide enough for a vehicle. They stopped at a point where the jungle pressed close on both sides and Fong said something in Thai. "This is as far as vehicles go," Somchai translated. "From here you walk. 15 kilometers to the border, then 40 more to the coordinates. 2 days if you move steadily. 3 if you are careful." "We'll be careful," Raymond said. They divided the gear into packs, distributing weight according to each man's capability. Thomas took less because of his prosthetic leg. David Chen took communications equipment and laptop. The others split weapons, ammunition, food, water, and medical supplies. James shouldered his pack and felt the familiar weight settle across his back and hips. It had been 15 years since he had carried a combat load, and his body complained immediately. But complaining was different from failing. He adjusted the straps and nodded to Raymond. "Ready." Somchai shook each man's hand. "Satellite phone has my number. When you are ready for extraction, call. I will have the helicopter airborne within 10 minutes. But remember, once you call, everyone will know. Move fast." The jungle swallowed them within 100 meters of leaving the vehicles. The canopy overhead blocked most of the sunlight, creating a twilight world of green and shadow. The heat was oppressive, humidity so thick it felt like breathing water. Within minutes, sweat soaked through James's shirt. Fong led, moving through the jungle with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime in it. His feet found secure footing automatically. His eyes scanned constantly, reading the terrain for signs James couldn't see. Kiat brought up the rear, ensuring no one fell behind or missed a turn. They walked in single file, maintaining spacing, conserving energy. No one spoke. The jungle provided enough noise with bird calls and insect sounds and the rustle of wind through leaves that conversation would have been difficult anyway. James found a rhythm, placing each foot carefully, using his walking stick to probe ground before committing his weight. The pack dug into his shoulders. His knees protested slopes and uneven terrain. But the discomfort was familiar, almost welcome. Pain meant he was still capable, still functional. Ahead of him, Raymond moved with the steady pace of a man who understood that endurance mattered more than speed. Behind, Thomas managed surprisingly well despite his prosthetic, using the terrain to his advantage, choosing paths that minimized the stress on his artificial leg. They stopped every hour for water and to check navigation. David Chen consulted a GPS unit the size of a phone, comparing their position against the coordinates. Fong would nod approval or shake his head and adjust their course slightly. Midday brought rain, a sudden downpour that turned the trail into mud and reduced visibility to a few meters. They sheltered under a rock overhang until the worst passed, then continued in drizzle that persisted for hours. The border, when they reached it, was unmarked except for a stone marker half hidden by vegetation. Fong pointed to it and said something in Thai. They had crossed from Thailand into Laos without fanfare or challenge. The jungle didn't recognize political boundaries. They made camp that night in a clearing barely large enough for 6 men to lie down. No fire, no light beyond what moonlight penetrated the canopy. They ate cold rations and spoke in whispers when they spoke at all. Raymond took first watch, sitting with his back to a tree, rifle across his lap, scanning the darkness for movement. James tried to sleep, but found himself staring up through the canopy at stars that appeared and disappeared between shifting leaves. His father was somewhere ahead, 25 kilometers according to David Chen's calculations. 2 days of hard walking through terrain that would punish old men who had forgotten what jungle meant. But they would make it. They had come too far to turn back. Somewhere in the darkness, something large moved through the underbrush. Probably a wild pig or deer, but possibly something else. The jungle held predators, human and animal, and neither respected good intentions. Raymond's silhouette never moved, steady as the stone marker they had passed hours earlier. Watch standing was a skill that didn't fade. The ability to stay alert for hours, to sort normal sounds from threats, to trust instinct honed by experience. They were all old, all carrying injuries and limitations, but they were also professionals who had survived by being better than amateurs. James finally slept near dawn, pulled under by exhaustion stronger than anxiety. Morning brought more walking. The terrain grew steeper as they climbed into low mountains. The trail switchbacking up slopes that left them all breathing hard. Thomas's prosthetic was causing problems, the socket rubbing against his stump despite padding. He walked with gritted teeth and refused offers to slow down. Near midday on the second day, Fong raised his fist, the universal signal to halt. The group froze. Fong tilted his head, listening to something James couldn't hear. Then he pointed ahead and whispered to Keith, who moved forward to investigate. 5 minutes passed. 10. Finally, Kiet returned and spoke quietly to Fong, who turned to Samuel. There is a village ahead, small, maybe 10 families. We must go around or through. Around is safer but adds hours. Through is faster, but people will see us. Samuel looked at Raymond, who nodded. We go through. 6 old men hiking are not threatening. We're farmers consulting on crops, remember? They approached the village slowly, making noise deliberately so as not to startle anyone. The structures were simple, raised on stilts, with pigs and chickens living underneath. Children played in the dirt while women tended cooking fires. A few old men sat in the shade watching the strangers with expressions that revealed nothing. Fong spoke to the village elder in what James assumed was Lao. Money changed hands, and the elder gestured them toward a path leading out the far side of the village. As they passed, James noticed something that made his chest tighten. An old man sitting outside one of the structures wore a faded green shirt with a patch on the shoulder. The patch was nearly worn through, but James recognized it. 1st Cavalry Division. The man had to be in his 80s, which meant he had fought during the Cold War conflicts, probably with American-supported forces. Their eyes met. The old man's face remained neutral, but he raised his hand slightly, fingers together, almost a salute. James returned the gesture, a moment of recognition between men who had fought similar wars on the same side half a century earlier. Then they were past the village, back into jungle, and the encounter became another memory to carry. The coordinates drew closer. David Chen checked their position every kilometer now, comparing GPS readings against the map. They were walking into territory that belonged to whoever could hold it, guided by 2 Thai scouts toward a compound that might contain James's father or might contain an ambush. Raymond voiced what they were all thinking. If someone wanted to lure us into a trap, this would be the way to do it. Remote location, no escape routes, us tired and spread out. Samuel agreed, which is why we go in careful. Fong and Kite scout ahead. We establish an observation point. Watch for an hour before we approach. Standard reconnaissance protocol. The final kilometers were the hardest, Not because of terrain, but because anticipation built with each step. James found himself scanning ahead for any glimpse of structures, any sign of habitation. His hands were steady on his rifle, but his heart hammered against his ribs. Finally, late in the afternoon of the second day, Fong raised his fist again. He pointed ahead and held up fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 structures visible. They established a hide position on a ridge overlooking a small valley. Through binoculars, James could see what Fong had spotted. A compound of buildings arranged around a central clearing. The structures were old but maintained, a mix of traditional Southeast Asian architecture and Western influences. Solar panels on one roof, a satellite dish on another, a generator shed, a well. Someone lived here, someone with access to power and communications. And in the clearing, sitting in a chair made from bamboo and rope, an old man. Even at this distance, even through binoculars that blurred fine details, James recognized the bone structure of his face, the way he held his shoulders despite age and illness. David Hartigan, alive, real. No longer a ghost on a cassette tape, but flesh and blood sitting in afternoon sunlight. But something was wrong. The age didn't match. The man in the photograph had looked perhaps 76. The man in the clearing looked older, much older. 85 seemed right, matching someone born in 1941 and surviving to 2026. James's hands shook so badly he had to lower the binoculars. Raymond put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed once, hard, an anchor against emotions that threatened to pull him under. Samuel scanned the compound with tactical eyes, counting threats, identifying firing positions, noting fields of fire and approaches. I see 2 armed guards, maybe more inside the buildings. They're not military, not quite. Contractors, probably. This place is defended. We go in at dusk, Thomas suggested. Light will be bad for shooting. We can get close before they spot us. David Chen looked up from his laptop. We have a problem. My monitoring software just flagged unusual communication traffic. Someone knows we're here, or suspects it. Traffic originated from this compound 30 minutes ago. Samuel lowered his binoculars and looked at each man in turn, which means this was expected. Whether it's a trap or your father calling for help, James, we're committed now. We go in tonight, we get him and whatever files he has, and we extract immediately. Sumchai gets the call the moment we have your father secured. James looked through the binoculars one more time. His father had stood up from the chair and was walking slowly toward one of the buildings, supported by a cane. Every step looked painful. Chemical exposure, the tape had said. Poison from operations that never ended. We go in, James said. Tonight, all of us come back, or none of us do. They waited for darkness, eating cold rations and checking weapons and preparing for what would be either reunion or firefight, or both. The jungle around them grew louder as diurnal creatures settled and nocturnal ones emerged. Cicadas created a wall of sound that would mask movement if they were careful. As the last light faded, Fong and Kiet led them down from the ridge, moving like shadows through vegetation that seemed determined to catch on every piece of equipment. The approach took an hour to cover 300 meters. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, concealed in jungle that pressed against the compound like something alive. Through gaps in the foliage, James could see lights in 2 of the buildings. Generators hummed softly. A guard walked the perimeter, rifle slung over his shoulder, more bored than alert. Samuel hand signaled the plan. Fong and Kiet would remain in the jungle, providing overwatch and covering their retreat. Thomas and Raymond would neutralize the guards. David Chen would secure the generator and communications. Samuel and James would enter the main building and extract David Hartigan. Simple, direct. 1,000 things that could go wrong. They moved on Samuel's signal, spreading out, each man remembering lessons learned decades ago about spacing and fields of fire and the difference between cover and concealment. James reached the main building's wall and pressed against it, breathing controlled despite a heart that felt like it might burst from his chest. Beside him, Samuel counted down with fingers. 3, 2, 1. They moved through the door in a fluid motion that muscle memory made automatic. Low light inside, a hallway leading to rooms. James went left, Samuel right, clearing spaces with movements that would have looked choreographed if they hadn't been the product of training, ingrained so deep it became instinct. A door at the end of the hallway. James approached it, rifle up, finger on the trigger guard. He paused outside, listening. Heard breathing, labored and rough. He pushed the door open. The room was simple. A bed, a table, a chair. medical equipment connected to a generator by extension cords, and in the bed, propped up on pillows, an old man who looked at James with eyes that had seen too much for too long. The man was clearly 85, not 76, gaunt, ravaged by illness, but unmistakably David Hartigan. "Hello, son. I was wondering when you'd get here." David Hartigan's voice was weak but unmistakable. The same voice from the cassette tape. The same voice that had taught James to hunt and shoot and stand tall. James lowered his rifle. "Dad?" The word felt strange in his mouth after 54 years of absence. David smiled, the expression transforming his gaunt face into something that looked briefly like the father James remembered. "We need to move quickly. They know you're here. Marcus Klein and his contractors. They'll be here within the hour. Everything you need is in the well behind the compound. Files, evidence, 50 years of operations. Get it and go. Don't wait for me." "We came for you," James said. "We're all leaving." Outside, gunfire erupted. Sharp cracks of automatic weapons. The deeper boom of Thomas's AK returning fire. Shouting in English, in another language James didn't recognize. Samuel appeared in the doorway. "We're compromised. We need to move now." James helped his father stand, supporting him when his legs nearly gave out. David Hartigan weighed almost nothing, muscle and fat burned away by sickness until only bone and determination remained. They moved into the hallway and found Raymond dragging a wounded guard. Thomas provided covering fire through a shattered window, his prosthetic leg braced against the wall for stability. David Chen's voice came over the radio. "Generator is down. I'm at the well. The case is here, waterproof and sealed. But we have vehicles approaching from the east. Multiple contacts, heavily armed." Samuel grabbed the radio. "Fung, Keat, fall back to Rally Point Alpha. Everyone else, fighting withdrawal to the well. Move." They exploded from this building into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit the clearing like lightning. Tracer rounds cut red lines through darkness. The contractors had arrived in force, professional and coordinated, pinning them against the jungle. James half-carried, half-dragged his father toward the well, while Raymond and Thomas laid down suppressing fire. Bullets cracked past them, too close, the sound of death moving at supersonic speed. They reached the well and found David Chen pulling up a waterproof case using rope and a pulley. The case was heavy, military-grade, sealed with locks that hadn't been opened in years. "Got it!" Chen shouted over the gunfire. "Let's go." The jungle swallowed them as they retreated, bullets shredding vegetation, contractors shouting orders. James stumbled over roots while supporting his father, who gasped with each step but kept moving. Behind them, explosions bloomed orange and red. Thomas had left parting gifts, claymore mines positioned to discourage pursuit. The blast bought them precious seconds. They ran through darkness, broken only by muzzle flashes behind them, fighting through jungle that tore at clothes and exposed skin, following Fong and Kiet, who somehow navigated terrain James could barely see. Samuel called Somchai on the satellite phone. "We need extraction, now, Rally Point Charlie." The coordinates James didn't know but trusted Samuel to remember. "Helicopter is lifting off," came Somchai's response. 15 minutes to your position. Can you hold?" "We'll hold." They reached a clearing barely large enough for a helicopter to land, a space where years ago someone had cut trees for reasons James would never know. The group formed a defensive perimeter, weapons facing outward, David Hartigan in the waterproof case in the center. Thomas was breathing hard, his face pale even in darkness. Legs not responding right, took shrapnel in the hydraulics. Raymond examined it quickly. "You can walk? For now, then you walk." The sound of rotors came from the west, growing louder. The beautiful thunder of a Huey helicopter that had saved countless lives in jungles decades ago. Somchai had kept the old bird flying through pure determination and mechanical skill. But from the east came the growl of vehicles and the shouts of men who had no intention of letting them escape. The contractors hit the clearing with coordinated fire, professional and brutal. Raymond went down, blood spreading across his shoulder. Thomas returned fire despite his damaged leg, buying seconds with carefully aimed shots. David Chen screamed into the satellite phone, calling for help that wouldn't arrive in time. And James held his father, both of them pressed into dirt that smelled of decay and growth. While tracer rounds drew geometry overhead, and old men fought like they were young again, refusing to yield even when youth and strength had abandoned them years ago. The helicopter appeared through the canopy, descending into hell with rotors that beat the air like war drums, and James knew that the next 5 minutes would determine whether any of them saw dawn. The Huey descended through gunfire like a mechanical angel, its rotors beating air into submission, while tracer rounds stitched patterns around its fuselage. The pilot held steady despite the chaos, trusting in armor plating installed decades ago for exactly this kind of hell. Sumchai had warned them that extraction under fire was always the hardest part. He hadn't mentioned it would feel like standing at the gates of eternity while deciding whether to knock. James held his father against the ground, feeling the old man's heart hammering through ribs that stood out like fence posts. David Hartigan weighed nothing, reduced by sickness to something barely substantial. But his eyes remained sharp and aware. He understood what was happening, understood they might all die in this clearing because of choices he had made 50 years ago. Raymond McKenna fired controlled bursts from behind a fallen log, his shoulder bleeding through a hasty field dressing that Thomas Kowalski had slapped on during a brief lull. Blood darkened Raymond's shirt, but his hands stayed steady on the rifle. 71 years old and still making every shot count, still buying seconds with accuracy that younger men couldn't match even with better equipment. Thomas himself had wedged his damaged prosthetic leg against a termite mound and was using it as a brace while he worked his AK-47 with the mechanical precision of someone who had long ago accepted that hesitation meant death. Shrapnel from the contractor's grenades had torn through the hydraulic system in his artificial leg, leaving it locked in position and useless for movement. He couldn't run anymore, but he could still shoot, and shooting was what the moment required. Samuel Washington coordinated their defense with calm authority that cut through the chaos like a blade through water. He called targets, directed fire, kept them organized when panic would have scattered them into the jungle to be hunted down individually. At 73, he moved like someone half his age when adrenaline overrode arthritis and age, proving that some skills were permanent installations in the nervous system. David Chen crouched beside the waterproof case they had pulled from the well, his laptop somehow still functioning despite being dragged through jungle and firefight. His face was illuminated by the screen's pale glow as he transmitted files to secure servers on halfway around the world, ensuring that even if they all died here, the evidence would survive. His hands shook, but they kept typing. The helicopter touched down with a thud that James felt through the ground. The side door flew open and Sumchai appeared, no longer the calm logistics coordinator, but a combat pilot who had spent years extracting men from hot landing zones. He waved frantically, shouting something lost in the rotor wash and gunfire. Samuel's voice cut through the noise. Thomas and Raymond first. They're wounded. Move. Thomas tried to stand and his leg gave out completely, the damaged hydraulics failing under stress. Raymond grabbed him under one arm and together they stumbled toward the helicopter in a shambling run that looked like a drunken three-legged race but got them aboard. Sumchai's door gunner, a Thai man with graying hair and scars that spoke of old wars, opened up with an M60 machine gun, the heavy weapon hammering out suppressing fire that forced the contractors to take cover. Chen next, Samuel ordered. Take the case. David Chen scooped up the waterproof container with both arms, the weight clearly too much for him, but managing it through sheer determination. He ran with awkward steps, a man more comfortable with keyboards than combat, but he made it to the helicopter and hands pulled him aboard. Fong and Keat materialized from the jungle like ghosts, their mission complete. They had stayed behind to cover the retreat, two old Thai scouts who remembered when Americans had kept their promises. They sprinted across the clearing with bullets tracking them, dirt geysers marking near misses, and dove through the helicopter's door with seconds to spare. Samuel looked at James. You and your father, go. James hauled David Hartigan to his feet, taking most of the old man's weight across his shoulders. His father tried to walk, but his legs had given up pretending they worked. James half carried, half dragged him toward the Huey while Samuel provided covering fire, the rifle bucking against the old general's shoulder with each measured shot. 20 meters to the helicopter, 15, 10. A contractor broke from cover, young and fast, and desperate to stop them. He brought his rifle up, finger tightening on the trigger, aiming for the easy target of two old men stumbling across open ground. Samuel's shot caught him in the chest. The contractor went down hard, his weapon flying from nerveless fingers. Samuel didn't pause to confirm the kill. He was already tracking to the next threat, already firing, already buying the seconds that James and his father needed. They reached the helicopter and strong hands pulled them aboard. James looked back for Samuel and saw the old general still in the clearing, still firing, still holding the line because someone had to, and he had decided that someone was him. Samuel, James shouted, come on! Samuel fired his last magazine empty, dropped it, and ran. Not the sprint of a young man, but the determined stride of someone who understood that survival was measured in will as much as speed. Bullets chased him across the clearing, snapping past with sounds like cracking whips. He was 3 meters from the helicopter when a round caught him in the hip. His leg buckled and he went down hard, rolling with the impact, training overriding pain. He tried to rise and his leg wouldn't support him. Thomas Kowalski threw himself out of the helicopter despite his ruined prosthetic, hitting the ground and crawling to Samuel with movements powered by pure stubbornness. He grabbed the general under the arms and dragged him backward, while the door gunner's M60 hammered overhead, brass casings raining down around them. They made it to the helicopter more through momentum than strength. Hands grabbed them and hauled them aboard in a tangle of limbs and blood and gear. Sumchai didn't wait for confirmation. The helicopter lifted immediately, rising above the clearing, while gunfire pursued them like angry hornets. A round punched through the thin aluminum skin of the fuselage and ricocheted around the interior before embedding itself in the ceiling. Another shattered one of the side windows. The door gunner kept firing until his ammunition belt ran dry, then grabbed a rifle and continued shooting one-handed while holding himself in the doorway with the other. The helicopter banked hard, putting the jungle between them and the contractors. The gunfire faded, replaced by the steady thunder of rotors and the whine of turbines pushed to their limits. Sumchai's voice crackled over the intercom. "We're clear. Heading for the border. ETA 20 minutes. The interior of the Huey looked like a field hospital after a major battle. Raymond sat with his back against the bulkhead, his shoulder wound seeping blood through field dressing that needed replacing. Thomas's prosthetic leg hung at an odd angle, the hydraulics completely destroyed and beyond field repair. Samuel lay on the deck with David Chen pressing gauze against the hip wound, trying to stem bleeding that looked worse than it probably was, but still serious enough. David Hartigan had passed out, either from exhaustion or shock, or simply relief that he was no longer in that compound. James held his father's head in his lap, feeling the shallow breathing, watching the chest rise and fall with effort that looked like it might stop at any moment. Fong and Keats sat near the door, their faces expressionless but their eyes alert. They had done this before, extracted from hot zones, watched friends bleed. The drill was familiar even if the players had changed. Raymond caught James's eye across the helicopter's interior and managed a tired smile. "Just like the old days, Hawk, except we're slower and bleed easier." The Thai border passed beneath them without ceremony, an invisible line that meant everything and nothing. They were out of Laos, technically safe, but safety was relative when half the team was wounded, and the evidence they had recovered could destroy careers and maybe governments. Sumchai brought the helicopter down at a private airstrip outside Chiang Mai, a facility that asked no questions as long as payment cleared. An ambulance was waiting, along with a doctor who looked like he had treated gunshot wounds before and knew better than to involve police. They transferred the wounded first. Samuel's hip wound was serious, but not fatal if treated properly. The bullet had missed the femoral artery by centimeters, a margin between life and death that combat veterans understood was often the only margin that mattered. Raymond's shoulder was messy but clean, the round having passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. Thomas refused treatment until his prosthetic was examined. The doctor looked at the damaged leg with the clinical interest of someone who had seen plenty of battlefield injuries, but fewer artificial limbs with hydraulic systems. "This I cannot fix, you need specialist, but I can stabilize for now, prevent further damage." "Do it," Thomas said. David Hartigan was moved to a private room in the clinic, a space that was more warehouse than hospital, but clean and equipped with monitoring equipment that beeped reassuringly. The doctor examined him with gentle efficiency, his expression growing grave. "This man is very sick, not from wounds, from disease. His liver is failing, his lungs are scarred. He needs hospital, real hospital with specialists." James stood beside the bed, looking down at his father's unconscious face. The old man looked every one of his 85 years, ravaged by chemical exposure and time and choices that had extracted prices still being paid. "How long does he have?" The doctor shook his head. "Weeks, maybe days if there are complications. I am sorry." David Chen had set up a secure communication station in an adjacent room, his laptop connected to satellite internet through equipment that looked military grade. He worked with intense focus, uploading files from the waterproof case, encrypting them, sending them to servers distributed across 3 continents. James found him there hours after the extraction, still typing despite exhaustion that made his hands shake. How much did we get? Everything, Chen said without looking up from the screen. 50 years of operations. Names, dates, bank accounts, mission reports. Your father was meticulous. He documented every operation he was part of, every order he received, every dollar that moved through the network. An Iron Pyramid? Chen pulled up a file directory showing hundreds of folders organized by year and operation name. It's all here. The original program from 1975. The unofficial continuation after it was officially shut down. The evolution into what appears to be a global network of off-the-books intelligence assets. Your father wasn't the only one. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, over the years. Who ran it? Chen clicked through files, his expression hardening. Senator Harrison Vance, like we suspected, but he wasn't alone. There's a council, 7 people who have been managing this network for decades. They call themselves the architects. Your father's files have communications between them, discussing operations, approving budgets, ordering sanctions against people who got too close to the truth. Sanctions, James repeated. You mean murders? Chen nodded. 4 pyramid assets killed in the last 6 months. Your father's files contain the orders. They decided the old assets were liabilities, loose ends that needed tying up before someone started asking the right questions. James felt rage building, hot and familiar, the kind that had gotten him through combat by channeling it into action rather than letting it consume him. We need to get this to someone who can use it, someone clean. Chen finally looked up from the laptop. I've already sent copies to 3 different journalists who specialize in national security reporting. I've also uploaded to secure servers that will automatically release everything if we don't check in every 72 hours. Dead man switch. Even if the architects kill us all, the truth comes out. Smart, James said. My father taught you well. Chen's expression softened. Your father was complicated. He did terrible things, but he also tried to mitigate damage, to play different sides against each other to prevent escalations. He believed he was reducing harm even while causing it. I don't know if that makes him a hero or a villain. Maybe both, James said. Maybe that's the only honest answer. He returned to his father's room and found the old man awake, eyes open and focused, despite the morphine drip keeping pain at manageable levels. David Hartigan looked at his son with an expression that carried 50 years of regret and hope and fear. Did you get the files? All of them. Chen is distributing them now. The world is going to know everything. David's eyes closed briefly, relief evident in the relaxation of muscles that had been tense even in unconsciousness. Good. That's good. James pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down heavily. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the extraction was fading, leaving exhaustion that settled into his bones like concrete. Why'd you do it, Dad? Why'd you work for them after the conflicts ended? David was quiet for a long time, his breathing labored, each word requiring effort. At first, survival. They broke me, James. Not with torture alone, though there was plenty. They broke me with time. 2 years watching men die from disease and despair. When they offered me a choice, I took it because I wanted to live. Simple as that. I was weak. He coughed, and James held a cup of water to his lips. Later, after the conflicts wound down, I couldn't come home. I had given them too much, done too many things that made me a traitor by any definition. So I kept working. Told myself I was doing good, preventing escalations, saving lives by feeding information to multiple sides. Kept telling myself that for 50 years. Did you believe it? David's eyes met his. Sometimes. Mostly I just tried to survive each day without thinking too much about what I'd become. But I kept records. Always kept records. Thought maybe someday they'd mean something, prove something. Now maybe they will. James reached out and took his father's hand, feeling the bones through skin that had gone thin as paper. I spent 54 years believing you died a hero. Then I spent 3 days knowing you were a traitor. Now I don't know what you were. Maybe both. Maybe neither. But you're still my father. David's grip tightened with surprising strength. I don't deserve forgiveness. Probably not. But you're getting it anyway. Because I'm tired of carrying hate. And because you called us in to fix what you broke. That counts for something. They sat in silence, broken only by the beep of monitors and the distant sound of traffic from Chiang Mai streets. A father and son separated by 50 years and choices that had bent one life into shapes the other could barely recognize, but still connected by blood and memory and the stubborn refusal to let go completely. Raymond appeared in the doorway, his shoulder heavily bandaged, but his color better than it had been on the helicopter. "We have a problem. Chen's been monitoring communications. The architects know we have the files. They're sending people." "How long do we have?" Raymond shook his head. "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. But this clinic isn't defensible, and none of us are in shape to fight off a professional hit team." James stood, his body protesting every movement. "Then we move. Get everyone mobile. Sumchai must have somewhere more secure." "Already asked. He's got a safe house in the mountains, 2 hours from here, remote, defensible, supplied for long-term occupation if necessary. He's arranging transport." They moved that night, loading the wounded into vehicles that looked civilian but had been modified with armor and reinforced suspensions. David Hartigan traveled in an ambulance with medical equipment that kept him stable. The doctor came with them, paid enough to forget his other patients and the risks of treating fugitives. The safe house turned out to be a compound built into a hillside, stone and concrete construction that looked like it dated from the French colonial period but had been updated with modern security. Cameras covered approaches. The walls were thick enough to stop rifle rounds. The gates were steel reinforced. Sumchai had prepared for scenarios exactly like this. They set up a defensive perimeter with overlapping fields of fire. Thomas, despite his destroyed prosthetic, took a position covering the main gate. Raymond watched the north approach. Fong and Kiet, who had stayed with them out of loyalty or honor, or simply because they had nowhere better to be, covered the east and west. Samuel Washington sat in what passed for a command center, monitoring security feeds and coordinating with Chen on the digital battlefield. His hip wound kept him from moving quickly, but his mind was sharp and his command presence undiminished by injury. James stayed with his father, watching the old man sleep fitfully, waking occasionally to cough or ask for water, or simply confirm he was still alive. The morphine kept most of the pain at bay, but it couldn't do anything about the knowledge that time was running out. On the third day in the safe house, Chen received confirmation that the files had reached the journalists. 2 major newspapers were running stories, carefully crafted to avoid legal problems while still exposing the core truth. Iron Pyramid had existed. It had continued beyond its official termination. It had evolved into a network that operated outside any oversight or accountability. The response was immediate and explosive. Congressional hearings were announced. The Intelligence Committee launched investigations. The FBI began interviewing everyone connected to the program who was still alive and findable. Senator Harrison Vance issued a statement denying everything, calling the accusations a fabrication by foreign intelligence services trying to undermine American security. But the evidence was too substantial to dismiss. Bank records matched payments. Dates aligned with operations. Names of assets corresponded to people who had disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. The truth might be complicated, but it was undeniable. On the 5th day, David Hartigan took a turn for the worse. His breathing grew labored. His skin took on a yellow tinge that indicated liver failure was accelerating. The doctor increased morphine but warned that the end was approaching. James sat beside his father's bed, holding the old man's hand, watching consciousness fade in and out like a radio signal breaking up. During a moment of clarity, David spoke with effort. "James, listen, there's one more thing, something not in the files. Save your strength, Dad." "No, important. The architects. There are 7. Vance is just one. The real leader, the one who started it all, who's been running it from the beginning." "Who?" David's eyes locked on his son's face. "Senator Patricia Davis. She's not what she seems. Presents herself as a reformer, but she created the whole system. Built her political career on exposing programs she herself designed. She knows about the files, knows what we're doing, and she'll do anything to protect the network." "You're sure?" David nodded weakly. "I've worked with her for 30 years. She recruited me after I defected, offered protection in exchange for loyalty. Every operation, every decision, it all flowed through her eventually. The others on the council think they're equals, but she's the architect, the real one." James felt the pieces shifting, the puzzle revealing a pattern more complex than he had imagined. "Does Chen know?" David shook his head. "Only me. Kept it separate, insurance policy. But now you know. Be careful, James. She has resources we can't imagine. And she's ruthless in ways that would surprise you." The old man's eyes closed, his breathing settling into a shallow rhythm that suggested sleep rather than death, at least for now. James found Chen in the command center and relayed what his father had said. The intelligence analyst's face went pale. "Senator Davis, She's the one who's been publicly calling for investigations. She's positioned herself as the hero fighting for transparency. Perfect cover, James said. She controls the investigation, can steer it away from anything that threatens her directly. Classic misdirection. Chen began typing furiously. I need to trace her connections, her financial history, her staff appointments over the years. If your father is right, there will be patterns. People she's placed in key positions, money that's moved through channels she controls. How long? Give me 6 hours. Raymond appeared in the doorway, his face grim. We've got movement on the access road. 3 vehicles, blacked out SUVs, moving slowly. Could be tourists, but tourists don't usually drive in tactical formation. Samuel limped over to the security monitors, his hip clearly causing pain despite medication. That's a hit team, professional, coordinated. They'll probe our defenses first, test response times, then hit us where we're weakest. How many? Assume 12 to 15 contractors. Former military, well-equipped, motivated by money and probably threats. They won't stop until we're dead, or they are. Thomas's voice came over the radio. I've got visual on the lead vehicle. Definitely military contractors. Recognize one of them from the compound in Laos. Marcus Klein's people. Samuel activated the compound's communication system, his voice broadcasting to speakers positioned around the perimeter. This is a private residence. You are trespassing. Leave now or face consequences. The vehicle stopped. A man emerged from the lead SUV, tall and fit, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had spent years in command. Even at a distance, James recognized the bearing of a professional soldier. Marcus Klein's voice came through a bullhorn. We're here for the files and the old man. Hand them over and you can walk away. Make this difficult and nobody walks away. Samuel looked at James, the question unspoken but clear. James activated his microphone. The files are already distributed. Killing us changes nothing. The truth is out. Klein lowered the bullhorn and conferred with his team. Then he raised it again. Senator Vance sends his regards and his instructions. No survivors. The first grenade launcher round hit the front gate with a crump that rattled windows throughout the compound. The second took out a camera. The third was smoke, creating a screen that obscured the contractor's approach. Thomas opened fire, his AK barking in controlled bursts despite the awkward position his damaged leg forced him to maintain. Raymond joined in from the north wall, targeting the vehicles to disable them and prevent escape. The contractors were good, advancing under covering fire with the kind of coordination that came from extensive training and combat experience. They breached the outer wall within minutes, using shaped charges that blew holes through stone and concrete. Samuel coordinated the defense, calling out targets and sectors, keeping them organized even as the contractors pushed deeper into the compound. But they were 6 old men and 2 Thai scouts against 15 professionals in their prime. The math was brutal and inevitable. A contractor made it to the main building and kicked in the door. Thomas shot him twice in the chest, but 2 more came through the opening. Raymond took one down before a burst of automatic fire forced him to take cover. Chen abandoned his laptop and grabbed a rifle, moving with the awkward determination of someone who had trained for this but never expected to need it. He fired through a window, more suppressing fire than aim shots, but it forced the contractors to slow their advance. James left his father's room and took a position covering the hallway. A contractor appeared at the far end, and James fired without thinking, muscle memory taking over. 2 rounds, center mass. The contractor went down, and James felt nothing. No satisfaction, no remorse, just the cold calculation of combat. The firefight devolved into chaos, rooms and hallways becoming kill zones where every corner might hide death. The contractors had superior numbers and equipment, but the defenders had intimate knowledge of the terrain and the desperate motivation of men with nothing left to lose. Fong and Keat fought like ghosts, appearing to shoot and then vanishing before return fire could find them. Their knowledge of guerrilla warfare, learned in jungles 50 years ago, served them well in the close quarters of the compound. But the contractors kept coming, pushing through casualties with the relentless pressure of people who knew that hesitation meant failure. They had been hired to complete a mission, and professional pride demanded they succeed. Samuel took a round through his good leg and went down hard. Chen dragged him to cover while Raymond provided covering fire that emptied his magazine and forced him to reload with hands that shook from pain and exhaustion. Thomas's prosthetic finally gave out completely, the damaged hydraulics failing under stress. He fell, unable to stand but continued firing from the ground with grim determination. They were losing, slowly inevitably being overwhelmed by younger men with more ammunition and fewer injuries. James knew it. They all knew it. And then the sound of helicopter rotors cut through the gunfire, growing rapidly louder. Not one helicopter, but three, descending toward the compound with the purposeful approach of military aircraft on a mission. The contractors heard it too and hesitated, uncertainty breaking their momentum. One pulled out a radio and spoke urgently. Then his face went pale. He shouted to his team, "Abort! Abort! We're compromised." The contractors began falling back, providing covering fire for each other as they retreated toward their vehicles. But the helicopters were already landing in the clearing beyond the compound walls, and armed men were deploying in numbers that made resistance futile. James recognized the unit patches as they entered the compound. Royal Thai Special Warfare Command, the kingdom's elite counterterrorism force. They moved with practiced efficiency, securing the area and calling for medical evacuation. An officer approached Samuel, who was being treated by a medic. "General Washington, we received intelligence about an attack on this location. Arrived as quickly as possible." Samuel managed a pained smile. "Excellent timing, Captain. Another 5 minutes and you'd have been collecting bodies." The officer's expression grew serious. "We also have orders to secure any American nationals present and transport them to the embassy in Bangkok." There's been a development. Senator Davis has been arrested by the FBI. Apparently, evidence emerged linking her to multiple illegal operations. Someone uploaded classified files to the Senate Intelligence Committee with her digital signature all over them. James and Chen exchanged glances. Chen shrugged. "I may have found some interesting documents in your father's files, and I may have ensured they reached the right people through channels that couldn't be traced back to us." The cleanup took hours. The wounded were evacuated to a military hospital in Chiang Mai, where real doctors could provide proper care. Marcus Klein and 3 of his contractors were captured alive. The rest had fled into the jungle or been killed in the firefight. David Hartigan was transported with full life support, the Thai military providing equipment and specialists beyond what the clinic doctor could offer. But everyone knew it was temporary measures. The old man was dying, and no amount of technology would change that. James rode in the helicopter with his father, watching monitors track vital signs that grew progressively weaker. They landed at the hospital and doctors took over, rushing David into intensive care while James waited in a corridor that smelled of disinfectant and fear. Raymond found him there hours later, his shoulder freshly bandaged and arm in a sling. The doctors say another day, maybe 2. His liver is shutting down completely. There's nothing they can do. James nodded, not trusting his voice. Raymond sat beside him on the plastic chairs that every hospital seemed to have. He came home, Hawk, not the way he planned, not the way any of us would choose, but he came home, and he did it knowing what it would cost. That's worth something. They sat in silence, 2 old soldiers waiting for death to claim someone they both loved, understanding that some battles can't be won no matter how fiercely they're fought. David Hartigan died the next afternoon, consciousness fading gradually into unconsciousness and then into nothing. James was holding his hand when the monitors flatlined, when the breathing stopped, when the body became just an empty vessel that had once held someone irreplaceable. The staff was respectful, giving James time before they moved the body. He sat beside his father for an hour, saying nothing, just being present for the end, in a way he hadn't been able to be for the beginning of this journey. Finally, he stood and walked out of the room without looking back. Raymond and Thomas and Samuel and Chen waited in the corridor, a battered group of old men who had fought together and bled together and survived together. "It's done," James said. They embraced him in turn, offering comfort that words couldn't convey. The American embassy arranged transport back to the United States, pulling strings to expedite paperwork and avoid difficult questions. David Hartigan's body was cremated in Thailand, his ashes placed in a simple urn that James carried personally through customs and security and all the bureaucratic machinery that separated one life from another. The story broke globally while they were in transit. Senator Patricia Davis arrested, Senator Harrison Vance found dead in his home from apparent suicide, though autopsy results raised questions. 12 other officials taken into custody, congressional investigations launched, intelligence community in turmoil, the Iron Pyramid network being systematically dismantled. James watched the news on airport television screens and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, just exhaustion and the weight of his father's ashes in the bag at his feet. They landed in San Francisco 6 days after leaving Laos, stepping onto American soil that felt both familiar and foreign after everything they had experienced. Immigration officers checked their passports with expressions that suggested they knew exactly who these men were and what they had done. A woman waited beyond security, 50-something, wearing a business suit and federal identification that marked her as FBI. She approached them with professional courtesy. "Gentlemen, I'm Special Agent Morrison. The Bureau would like to debrief you regarding the Iron Pyramid files and your activities in Southeast Asia. It's voluntary, but your cooperation would be appreciated." Samuel spoke for the group. "We'll cooperate fully, Agent Morrison, but first we need to take care of our brother." She nodded, understanding. "Of course. We can arrange a schedule that accommodates your needs. And gentlemen, unofficially, thank you. What you did took courage. A lot of people are grateful, even if they can't say so publicly." They separated at this airport, each heading to their own homes and families, promising to reunite for the funeral. James flew to Montana alone, carrying his father's ashes and a lifetime of complicated feelings about duty and betrayal in the spaces between. Gunny greeted him at the cabin, gray muzzle and arthritic legs but tail wagging with pure joy at his return. James knelt and embraced the dog, letting himself feel something uncomplicated and good after weeks of moral ambiguity. That night, he sat on the porch with his father's urn, watching stars emerge over mountains that had witnessed countless human dramas and remained unmoved. Somewhere up there, light from distant suns traveled through vacuum, arriving at his eyes after journeys measured in years and light years. His father had traveled his own distance, from Montana to Central America to Laos and finally home, taking 50 years to complete a circle that should have closed in 1973. But he had made it, flawed and broken and redeemed in ways both large and small. James opened the urn and poured some of the ashes into his hand. Tomorrow he would scatter them in places his father had loved, the creek where they had fished, the meadow where they had hunted elk, the ridge overlooking the valley where a young boy had learned to shoot. But tonight, he simply held them and remembered. Not just the betrayal or the years lost, but the good times too, the lessons taught, the love given. The man his father had been before classified operations in captivity, and time had transformed him into someone else. The protocol had been honored, the promise kept, the circle closed. And in the end, that had to be enough. 6 months after the ashes settled into Montana soil, James Hartigan received an envelope bearing the official seal of the Department of Defense. The letter inside was brief and formal, the kind of bureaucratic language that turned human stories into administrative actions. But the meaning was clear. The United States Army had reviewed the case of Lieutenant David Michael Hartigan and determined that his service record warranted correction. The designation of killed in action, previously listed as a training accident, would be amended to reflect died in service following extended captivity during classified Cold War operations. A memorial service would be held at Arlington National Cemetery on the first Saturday in June. The family was invited to attend. James read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing layers he had missed before. Extended captivity during classified Cold War operations. Not defection, not treason. The government was offering a version of truth that balanced reality with dignity, acknowledging his father's suffering without condemning his choices. He called Raymond McKenna first. "They're giving him Arlington. Full military honors." Raymond was quiet for a long moment. "That's more than I expected. Someone high up decided the truth was too complicated for a tombstone. Is that wrong? To let him be remembered as a hero instead of a traitor?" Raymond's sigh carried 50 years of moral ambiguity. "Your father was both, Hawk, and neither. He was a man who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Let the stone say what it says. The people who need to know the whole truth already do." James made the same call to Samuel Washington, Thomas Kowalski, and David Chen. All of them agreed to attend. This would be their final mission together, the closing ceremony for a protocol that had consumed 6 months of their lives and nearly killed them all. The weeks before the service passed in a strange suspension of normal time, James found himself thinking about his father constantly, not with the grief that had defined the first months, but with a kind of contemplative acceptance. His father had lived an extraordinary life, tragic and complicated, but ultimately purposeful in ways that mattered. He spent his days preparing the cabin for a Montana winter, chopping wood and checking the roof and ensuring supplies were adequate for the months of snow that would isolate him from civilization. Gunny supervised from the porch, her gray muzzle resting on her paws, content to watch her human engage in the rituals of survival. In the evenings, James read his father's files, not the operational documents that Chen had distributed to congressional committees and journalists, but the personal journals David Hartigan had kept throughout his 50 years in exile. They painted a picture of a man wrestling with guilt and duty, trying to find meaning in choices that had stripped away most of what made life worth living. One entry from 1985 particularly struck him. James graduated from the Naval Academy today. I saw pictures through my handler. He looked so much like I did at that age. Strong, confident, ready to serve. I wanted to be there, to shake his hand, to tell him I'm proud, but I gave up that right when I chose survival over honor. All I can do now is hope he becomes the man I failed to be. James closed the journal and sat in darkness, understanding his father in ways that would have been impossible without these words. The man had punished himself for 50 years, carrying guilt that no external judgment could match. Whatever redemption existed had to come from within, and his father had never quite found it. But maybe, James thought, bringing him home had offered something close. A chance to confess, to be known fully by his son, to die surrounded by people who understood complexity rather than demanded purity. The flight to Washington took James through Denver, where he met Raymond and Thomas. Samuel flew in from Wyoming. Chen drove from Virginia, where he had testified before 3 different congressional committees and written reports that would be classified for decades. They gathered at a hotel near Arlington. 5 old men who looked like any other veterans attending a military funeral. But the scars they carried, visible and invisible, told stories that most people couldn't begin to imagine. The night before the service, they shared dinner in Raymond's hotel room. Chinese takeout eaten from cardboard containers, the kind of meal that required no pretense or formality. They talked about everything except the ceremony, discussing grandchildren and fishing trips and the various ways their bodies were betraying them. Finally, as the evening grew late, Samuel raised the question they had all been avoiding. What do we do after tomorrow? The protocol is complete. Your father is home and honored. The network is exposed. We've done what we set out to do. Thomas shifted his prosthetic leg, which had been rebuilt by a specialist in Denver, but still gave him trouble. We go back to our lives. I've got a gun shop to run, customers who depend on me, a granddaughter who wants me to teach her to shoot. Raymond nodded. I've got Sarah visiting next month. Promised to take her hiking before the snow comes. Show her the mountains her grandmother loved. Chen adjusted his glasses. I need to care for Linda. Her Alzheimer's is progressing. She still has moments of clarity, but they're getting rarer. I want to be present for as many as possible. Samuel looked at James. What about you, Hawk? James considered the question carefully. I don't know yet. Part of me wants to keep fighting, to track down the remnants of the network that Davis said still exist. But another part is just tired, wants to sit on my porch and watch seasons change and let younger people handle the battles. Raymond leaned forward. There's wisdom in knowing when you've done enough. We're in our 70s, most of us. We've served our country, honored our promises, done things most people never could. Maybe it's okay to rest now. But the network is still out there, James said. Davis was right about that. We damaged it, but didn't destroy it. Samuel's expression was gentle but firm. There will always be another network, another threat, another battle. That's the nature of the world. But we can't fight forever. At some point, we have to trust that we've laid groundwork for others to build on. That the example we set matters more than any single victory. The words settled over them like a benediction, granting permission to be old, to be tired, to have limits. They talked late into the night, not about missions or enemies or moral complexities, but about simple things. The way coffee tastes better when drunk watching sunrise. The satisfaction of splitting wood with a clean stroke. The peace that comes from sitting beside someone who doesn't need words to communicate understanding. These were the truths that survived when everything else fell away. Connection, presence, the steady accumulation of small moments that added up to a life worth living. Morning came with the kind of perfect weather that made you believe in providence. Clear skies, moderate temperature, a gentle breeze that carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and flowering trees. Arlington National Cemetery spread across rolling hills, row after row of white marble headstones marking lives that had ended in service. They arrived early and were escorted to a section reserved for recent additions, where a simple marker had been placed temporarily until the permanent stone could be installed. The marker read, Lieutenant David M. Hartigan, United States Army, 1941 to 2026. The numbers looked right now. 85 years of life, most of it lived in shadows and compromises, but all of it ultimately leading here. An honor guard assembled with precise movements, 7 soldiers in dress uniforms who handled the flag with reverence that transcended duty. A bugler stood ready, his instrument polished to mirror brightness. A chaplain waited with a book that probably contained words about sacrifice and service and the better angels of human nature. People began arriving. Officials James didn't recognize, men and women in suits who represented the government his father had served and betrayed in roughly equal measure. A delegation from the Senate Intelligence Committee, there to acknowledge that even complicated lives deserved honorable remembrance. And then others, families of men who had been POWs during the Cold War, who understood the specific kind of suffering that came from years in captivity. Veterans from operations his father had supported, people who had benefited from intelligence he had provided even while working for multiple masters. James was surprised by how many came. He had expected a small ceremony, a formality to close paperwork. Instead, nearly 100 people gathered, testimony to a life that had touched more people than he had realized. The ceremony began with the chaplain's invocation, words about service and sacrifice that managed to be both generic and moving. Then came remarks from a general James didn't know, speaking about the complexity of the Cold War and the impossible choices faced by men in captivity. He mentioned the protocol without naming it specifically, talking about bonds between soldiers that transcended politics and ideology. He spoke of loyalty to brothers in arms as the purest form of military service, more fundamental than loyalty to flag or country. James found himself nodding, recognizing his own journey in those words. The honor guard lifted the flag from the temporary casket, which contained only symbolic representations since some of the ashes had been scattered months ago in Montana, with a portion reserved for this ceremony. They folded it with movements so precise they looked choreographed, creating the triangle that would be presented to James as next of kin. The first note of taps pierced the morning air, and James felt his throat tighten. This melody had played at his son's funeral, at his wife's memorial, at countless ceremonies throughout his military career. It never got easier to hear. The bugler's breath control was perfect, each note pure and sustained, the melody carrying across the cemetery to where thousands of other veterans rested. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, an eternal lament for all the wars and all the men who hadn't come home whole. James thought about his father hearing this melody in a detention cell, wondering if anyone would play it for him, wondering if his son would grow up knowing his sacrifice or believing his absence meant abandonment. The last note faded into silence so complete it felt sacred. The general approached James and presented the folded flag with words worn smooth by repetition but still carrying weight. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service. James took the flag, feeling its weight, remembering the first time he had accepted this triangle of cloth for his father 53 years ago. That flag had represented a lie wrapped in honor. This one represented truth wrapped in ambiguity. He pressed it against his chest and nodded his thanks, not trusting his voice. The ceremony concluded with a 3-volley salute, 7 rifles firing in unison, 3 times, the sharp cracks echoing across the cemetery, birds scattered from nearby trees. The smell of gunpowder drifted on the breeze. James closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. Each report a punctuation mark on a life that had been defined by violence and service in complicated proportions. People approached afterward, offering condolences and sharing brief stories about his father. A former CIA officer mentioned an operation in 1982 that David Hartigan's intelligence had made possible, saving American lives in Beirut. A State Department official spoke about negotiations in the 90s, where his father's insights had prevented escalation between regional powers. Each story added dimension to a man James had only partially known, revealing layers of competence and commitment that complicated the narrative of simple betrayal. Raymond stood beside James throughout, a steady presence that required no words. When the crowd finally thinned, he spoke quietly. Your father would have been proud, not of the ceremony maybe, but of you, of the man you became despite his absence. James looked at the temporary marker, at the dates that bookended a life. I wish I could have known him better. Not just the hero from my childhood or the broken man in Laos, the whole person with all the contradictions. Raymond's hand gripped his shoulder. That's the privilege and curse of being a son. We only ever know fragments of our fathers. They protect us from their full complexity until we're old enough to understand. By then, it's usually too late for questions. A woman approached, perhaps 60, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had spent a career in positions of authority. She extended her hand. Colonel Hartigan, I'm Catherine Hayes. I was the Inspector General who initiated the investigation into Iron Pyramid based on your evidence. James shook her hand. Thank you for taking it seriously. A lot of people wanted to bury it. Hayes smiled sadly. A lot of people still do. But the truth has a way of demanding acknowledgement, especially when people like you refuse to let it be forgotten. Your father's files have reformed how we conduct oversight. That's a legacy worth having. She handed him a business card. If you ever want to know more about the impact your father's work had, call me. There are things I can share that haven't been made public, things that might help you understand him better. James pocketed the card, knowing he would call eventually. The need to understand wasn't finished, might never be finished. As the cemetery emptied, James and his team stood together around the gravesite. 5 old men who had kept a promise and paid prices they were still calculating. Samuel broke the silence. I've been thinking about what we do next, about whether the protocol ends here or continues in some form. Thomas looked at him questionfully. What do you mean? Samuel gestured at the cemetery around them. We're not the only ones who served in shadows, who made impossible choices, who lived with compromises that haunt us. There are others out there, people who need someone to remember them, to understand them, to bring them home when the time comes. You're talking about making this permanent, Raymond said. An actual organization instead of one-time mission. Samuel nodded. Not official, never official, but a network of people who understand that service isn't always clean, that loyalty sometimes means breaking rules, that honor can exist in complicated places. Chen adjusted his glasses, thinking. It would need to be carefully structured, compartmented, protected from the kind of infiltration that compromised the original programs. We're too old to run it, Thomas pointed out. We barely survived this mission. Samuel smiled. We don't run it, we advise. We're the council of elders who younger people consult when they face situations that don't fit normal rules. We're the institutional memory that prevents each generation from making the same mistakes. James considered the proposal, feeling its weight and possibility. My father spent 50 years trapped by secrets. I don't want to spend my remaining years the same way. Samuel's expression was understanding. This wouldn't be about secrets. It would be about service, about being available when someone needs help that can't come through official channels. You don't have to decide now. But think about it. They left the cemetery together, 5 men walking between rows of white stones that stretched to horizons they couldn't see. Each stone represented a life, a story, a collection of choices that had led to this final resting place. James paused at the grave of the unknown soldier, reading the inscription that honored those who had died in service but remained unidentified. His father had almost joined their ranks, almost been lost to anonymity and speculation. But the protocol had brought him home, given him a name on a stone, connected him back to the family and country he had served in ways both honorable and shameful. That evening, the team gathered at a restaurant in Georgetown, a quiet place where they could talk without being overheard. They ordered steaks and wine, celebrating not victory but survival, not success but completion. Thomas raised his glass. To David Hartigan, a complicated man who deserved a complicated remembrance. They drank to that, acknowledging nuance in a world that preferred simple narratives. Chen pulled out his laptop and showed them something he had been working on. A secure database that documented operations like Iron Pyramid, collecting evidence and testimony from people who had served in shadows. Not for publication, but for preservation. So that when future generations face similar ethical dilemmas, they would have context and cautionary tales. This is what we can do, he said. We can make sure the lessons aren't lost, that people understand there are no clean wars, no simple choices, no perfect solutions. Just men and women trying to do their best with incomplete information and impossible circumstances. Samuel studied the database with approval. That's exactly what we need. Not to glorify what happened, but to ensure it's understood in full complexity. Raymond looked at James. What about you, Hawk? Are you in? James thought about his cabin in Montana, about the quiet life he had imagined living. Then he thought about his father's journals, about the isolation that came from carrying secrets alone, about the value of having people who understood complexity instead of demanding purity. I'm in, but on my own terms. I won't be available constantly. I've got a life to live, a dog to walk, firewood to split. But when someone needs help that can't come through official channels, when a promise needs keeping, call me. That's all we're asking, Samuel said. They finished dinner and walked back to the hotel through Washington streets that glowed with artificial light, pushing back the darkness. The city hummed with the constant activity of government and politics, of people making decisions that would affect millions of lives they would never meet. James thought about the fact that somewhere in these buildings, other networks were forming, other compromises being made, other men and women facing choices between expedience and principle. The work would never be finished. But maybe that was the point. Each generation had to make its own decisions about where lines should be drawn. The next morning, James flew back to Montana alone. The others had their own journeys, their own lives to resume. But they had exchanged contact information, created an encrypted communication channel, established the infrastructure for whatever the protocol would become. James landed in Kalispell and drove to his cabin through mountain passes where late spring snow still clung to north-facing slopes. The air smelled of pine and clear water, impossibilities that didn't require complications. Gunny greeted him with enthusiasm that reminded him why dogs were better than most people. She didn't care about moral ambiguity or geopolitical consequences. She cared about walks and meals and the presence of her human, simple needs, simply met. He unpacked and stood on his porch, looking out at landscape that had shaped his father and himself and the complicated relationship between duty and desire. The mountains stood eternal and indifferent, having witnessed human drama for millennia and remaining unmoved. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Thank you for bringing him home. He talked about you constantly. You were his greatest pride and his deepest regret. He died at peace because of you. James stared at the message, wondering who had sent it. Then a second message appeared. This is Samuel. I've been in touch with your father longer than I admitted. He asked me to watch over you from a distance. I'm glad I could help bring him home. The protocol continues. James felt a weight lift. The mystery of a friend was solved. Samuel had been the connection all along, the guardian angel working in shadows. He typed back, "Thank you for keeping watch, for all of it." The reply came quickly. "It's what brothers do. Rest now. We'll call when needed." James set down the phone and raised his glass of whiskey to the sunset, to his father, to Samuel's quiet loyalty, to everyone who had fought and sacrificed and kept promises when it would have been easier to walk away. A week later, James received a package from the Department of Defense. Inside was a medal case containing a Defense Distinguished Service Medal, one of the highest awards for military service. The citation was deliberately vague, mentioning extraordinary service under exceptional circumstances during classified Cold War operations, contributions to national security that could not be detailed, and devotion to duty that exemplified the highest traditions of military service. There was also a letter from the Secretary of Defense, marked personal and confidential. Colonel Hartigan, your father's complete service record has been reviewed at the highest levels. While the specific nature of his contributions must remain classified, I want you to know that his work prevented conflicts, saved American lives, and demonstrated courage in circumstances that would have broken lesser men. He served with distinction during the most challenging period of the Cold War, and his country is grateful. This medal is presented posthumously in recognition of that service. James held the medal case, feeling its weight, understanding that this was as close to public acknowledgement as his father would ever receive. The truth would remain classified, accessible only to people with need to know and security clearances that most citizens couldn't imagine. But James knew, his team knew, and now there was a medal case that could sit on a mantle and represent something true even if it couldn't tell the whole story. He placed it beside his son's memorial flag and his own service medals, creating a display that spanned 3 generations of Hartigan men who had served in uniform. Each had made sacrifices. Each had faced impossible choices. Each had done their best with the circumstances they were given. That evening, James video called Raymond, showing him the medal. They finally acknowledged him. Raymond studied the medal through the screen, his expression complex. That's good, but you know the real honor wasn't from the government. It was from you. You brought him home. You listened to his story. You forgave him. That meant more than any medal. I know, but this helps too. Gives me something to point to when people ask about him. They talked for an hour, not about missions or medals, but about ordinary things. Raymond's granddaughter had caught her first fish. Thomas was teaching a veterans group how to shoot. Samuel was planning a flight over Yellowstone. Chen's wife had a good week with minimal confusion. Life was happening, the everyday accumulation of moments that gave meaning to the dramatic chapters. As autumn settled over Montana, James established a routine that felt sustainable. He woke with sunrise and spent mornings working on the cabin and property. Afternoons were for reading and correspondence. Evenings for sitting on the porch with Gunny and watching the world prepare for winter. Once a week, he checked the encrypted channel Samuel had established. Usually it was quiet. Occasionally someone would post a question or share information. They were building institutional memory, collecting wisdom from careers spent in shadows. One evening, a message appeared from someone James didn't recognize. The encryption confirmed it was from a trusted source, someone vetted by Chen. I served in a program similar to Iron Pyramid. Different region, different era, same moral complexity. I'm dying from injuries sustained during an operation that officially never happened. My family believes I worked in logistics. I don't want to die with that lie between us, but I can't tell them without exposing operations still classified. What do I do? James read the message 3 times, feeling the weight of someone else's father facing the same dilemmas his father had faced. He typed carefully, "Tell them as much truth as you can, that you served in ways you can't detail, that you made sacrifices you can't explain, that you loved them even when duty kept you distant. They won't understand everything, but they'll understand enough. And when you're gone, they'll have truth instead of lies to remember you by." The response came an hour later. "Thank you. That's what I needed to hear." Permission to be incomplete, but honest. James stared at those words, recognizing his own journey in them. His father had been incomplete, but ultimately honest. That imperfection was what made the story human rather than heroic mythology. Over the following months, more messages appeared in the channel. Veterans struggling with classified pasts, family members trying to understand loved ones who had served in shadows, researchers documenting operations that existed between official history and complete obscurity. The protocol was evolving into something larger than one rescue mission. It was becoming a repository of complicated truths, a place where nuance was honored instead of simplified. James found purpose in contributing to those conversations, offering perspective shaped by his own journey. He wasn't an expert or authority, just someone who had walked a particular path and could offer guidance to others facing similar terrain. Winter came to Montana with the sudden finality that high-altitude climates impose. Snow buried the landscape, transforming familiar terrain into something pristine and unforgiving. James split wood and kept the fire burning and settled into the hibernation that mountain winters demand. Gunny aged noticeably, her muzzle completely white now, her movements slower and more deliberate. She was 14, ancient for a German shepherd, but her eyes remained alert and her devotion unwavering. James knew he would lose her soon, knew he would face another funeral, another goodbye. But for now, she was present and warm and loyal. That was enough. On the anniversary of his father's death, James hiked to the ridge despite snow that made the journey difficult. He carried a thermos of coffee and sat on the rock where he had scattered ashes a year before. The valley below was white and silent, wind having sculpted the snow into patterns that looked almost intentional. Smoke rose from a few distant cabins, evidence of other people choosing isolation and self-reliance. James poured coffee and raised the cup in salute. "1 year, Dad. 1 year since you came home. The world keeps turning. The network you exposed is rebuilding in different forms. But some things changed because of what you did. That has to count for something." The mountains offered no response, but James didn't need one. He was talking to himself as much as to memory, processing the year through ritual and reflection. He thought about the protocol, about promises kept and circles closed, about his team scattered across the country but connected through shared experience, about the people reaching out through encrypted channels looking for understanding in a world that preferred simple narratives. This was his father's legacy, not the medals or the corrected service record or even the files that had exposed corruption. But the idea that complicated lives deserve complicated remembrance, that truth could coexist with honor. That service sometimes meant working in shadows while hoping for light. James finished his coffee and began the hike back to his cabin, each step requiring attention in deep snow. Gunny would be waiting, probably worried by his extended absence. The fire would need tending. Life would continue its quiet insistence. At the cabin, he found a message on his phone. Raymond had forwarded something from Catherine Hayes. The final report on Iron Pyramid had been released in heavily redacted form. The conclusion stated that while serious violations had occurred, reforms had been implemented to prevent future abuses. 17 people remained in prison. The network was declared permanently disbanded. James knew better. Networks never truly died. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that each generation had to fight the same battles in slightly different forms. That vigilance was permanent because human nature was permanent. He settled into his chair by the fire and opened his father's journal to a random page. The entry was from 1998. James is stationed in Kuwait. I saw intelligence reports about his unit. He's good at what he does. Natural leader, respected by his men. I wonder if I had come home, if I had been present in his life, would he still have joined the military? Or was he searching for the father he never knew? I'll never know the answer. That's my punishment, I suppose. Wondering forever about the roads not taken, James closed the journal and stared into the fire, thinking about roads and choices and the way lives branch in directions that seem inevitable only in retrospect. The protocol was complete. His father was home. The truth was documented. Justice, imperfect but real, had been served. What remained was living. Not just surviving or enduring, but actually engaging with the world in ways that brought meaning and connection. And for the first time in a very long time, James Hartigan felt ready for that challenge. Spring arrived in Montana with the abruptness of a door opening, snow melting in days that should have taken weeks, revealing ground that looked wounded but ready to heal. James Hartigan stood on his porch watching the transformation. Coffee steam rising in the cool morning air, Gunny pressed against his leg with the steady warmth of companionship that required no words. 14 months had passed since the cassette tape arrived. 14 months since he had learned his father was alive. 12 months since David Hartigan died in a Thai hospital. 6 months since Arlington. The cabin behind him held the accumulated weight of those months. His father's journals lined one shelf, their pages filled with 50 years of confession and rationalization and rare moments of clarity. The metal case sat on the mantel beside the folded flags, 3 generations of service compressed into symbols that meant everything and nothing. James's phone buzzed. A message in the encrypted channel that Samuel had established for the protocol. New request. Former asset, Cold War era, requesting extraction from nursing facility before memory goes completely. Family doesn't know his real history. Wants truth told before it's too late. Location, Colorado Springs. Time sensitive. James read the message twice. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to stay in Montana and let someone else handle the complications. But he understood what it meant to want truth acknowledged before death erased the possibility. His father had wanted that, had earned it barely. He typed, "I'll take it, send details." Within an hour, he had a dossier. Robert Vance, 82 years old, worked as an asset during Cold War conflicts in Central America under Iron Pyramid predecessor program. Diagnosed with advanced dementia, maybe 6 months of lucidity left. 3 adult children who believed he'd been a civilian contractor. He wanted to tell them the truth before he forgot it himself. James called Raymond. Got a request through the channel, old asset in Colorado. Wants to confess to his family before dementia takes him. You interested? Raymond's response was immediate. Sarah's with her mother this week. I've got time. What's the play? Extraction's wrong word. More like facilitation. We help him tell his story in a way that doesn't violate classification, but gives his family truth. That's delicate work. That's why we do it ourselves. They met in Colorado Springs 3 days later, renting a conference room at a hotel near the nursing facility. James had coordinated with Robert Vance's oldest daughter, explaining only that her father had worked in classified programs during the Cold War and wanted to share what he could before his memory deteriorated further. The daughter, Margaret, was 58, a school teacher with her father's eyes and a wariness that came from years of unanswered questions. He's never talked about his work, Said it was boring contractor stuff, logistics and supply chains. But sometimes he'd wake up screaming, talking about jungles and gunfire. We learned not to ask. James recognized the pattern, the lies told to protect families, the secrets that created distance measured in decades. What he wants to tell you won't be boring. It won't be complete because some things are still classified. But it will be true. That's what matters. Robert Vance arrived in a wheelchair, pushed by a nursing aide. He was thin, fragile, but his eyes held a sharpness that dementia hadn't yet stolen. He looked at James and Raymond, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition not of faces, but of type. "You boys are operators," James nodded. "Were. Long time ago. We're here because you called the protocol." Robert's hand shook slightly as he gripped the wheelchair arms. "Didn't think anyone still honored it. Thought I'd die with the lies." "The protocol doesn't expire," Raymond said quietly. "We brought one of our own home. We'll help you do the same." Robert's 3 children assembled in the conference room. Margaret, her younger brother Thomas, and the youngest sister Carolyn. They sat across from their father, confusion and concern evident on their faces. James facilitated, explaining that their father had worked in classified intelligence operations during the Cold War, that he had served in dangerous places doing difficult work that couldn't be acknowledged publicly, that he wanted to share what he could before his memory made it impossible. Robert spoke haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. He told them about Honduras, about running assets behind enemy lines, about making choices between bad options and worse ones. He didn't mention specific operations or names, but he gave them the shape of his service, the outline of sacrifices they hadn't known he'd made. "I lied to you for 50 years, said I pushed paper in an office. Truth is, I was in the field, working sources, collecting intelligence that saved American lives but cost others. I'm not asking you to forgive me for the lies, just to understand why I told them." Margaret was crying silently. Her brother Thomas looked angry. Caroline simply stared, trying to reconcile the father she'd known with this stranger confessing secrets. "Why tell us now?" Margaret asked. "After all these years?" "Because dementia is taking my memory. Soon I won't remember the truth myself. And I didn't want to die with you thinking I was someone I wasn't, even if who I was isn't pretty." The session lasted 2 hours. James and Raymond provided context when needed, helped Robert navigate between what could be said and what remained classified. By the end, the family hadn't forgiven all the years of deception, but they understood. And understanding was what Robert had needed. As they wheeled him back to the nursing facility, Robert grabbed James's arm with surprising strength. "Your father, David Hartigan. I knew him. We worked together in 83 Bangkok Station. He was trying to play both sides even then, trying to minimize damage while staying alive. Tell me you brought him home." James felt emotion rising. "I did. He died in my arms in Thailand. We scattered his ashes in Montana and buried a portion at Arlington. He got the recognition he deserved." Robert's eyes glistened. "Then the protocol still means something. Thank you." Driving back to Montana, James called Samuel. "The protocol's working. That asset in Colorado, we helped him tell his family the truth. They may never fully understand, but they have context now. That matters." Samuel's voice carried satisfaction. "That's exactly what this should be. Not dramatic rescues or firefights. Just helping people close circles before time runs out. We're going to get more requests like this." "I know, I'm ready." Over the following year, James took 4 more protocol requests. An old CIA officer in Florida who wanted his grandson to know he had helped stop a coup in 1979. A former Army intelligence analyst in Oregon who needed to explain to her daughter why she'd missed so many birthdays. A retired Air Force pilot in Texas who wanted his medals explained to grandchildren who thought he'd been a cargo hauler. Each case was different, but the pattern was the same. Old warriors wanting truth acknowledged before death or dementia erased the possibility. Families deserving context for absences and secrets that had defined their relationships. The work was quieter than the Laos extraction, less dramatic than the firefight in Thailand, but it felt more important somehow, more human. This was what the protocol was meant to be. Not about networks and conspiracies and political intrigue, about people keeping promises to each other across decades and generations. James documented each case in the secure database Chen had created, not for publicity, but for preservation, so future generations would understand that service came in many forms, that sacrifices weren't always visible, That truth mattered even when it was complicated. One autumn evening, James received a call from Catherine Hayes, the Inspector General who had investigated Iron Pyramid. Colonel Hartigan, wanted to update you on something significant. We've traced additional operations connected to the network. Your father's files kept giving us new leads. We've now identified and shut down 3 successor programs that were operating in the same shadows Iron Pyramid did. James felt a mixture of satisfaction and weariness. Will it ever really end? Hayes was quiet for a moment. Probably not. But each program we expose makes the next one harder to hide. Your father's contribution to that can't be overstated. He didn't just document Iron Pyramid. He created a template for transparency that's changing how we conduct oversight. She paused. There's something else. We found evidence in his later files that he was actively sabotaging operations he believed crossed ethical lines. Starting in the mid-90s, he would feed bad intelligence, delay critical information, create friction that prevented the worst outcomes. He was fighting them from inside, even while appearing to cooperate. James felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he hadn't realized was there. He was still serving in his own way. Yes, and I wanted you to know that his actions saved lives. We've documented at least 7 operations that were canceled or modified because of intelligence he manipulated. He wasn't just a collaborator, Colonel. He was a saboteur working for the right side while everyone thought he was compromised. After Hayes hung up, James sat with that knowledge, letting it reshape his understanding of his father's 50 years in exile. Not passive betrayal, but active resistance. Not simple collaboration, but complicated loyalty to values that transcended any single allegiance. He walked to the ridge where he had scattered ashes 18 months earlier and spoke to the wind and the mountains and whatever might be listening. You were still fighting, Dad? Still trying to do right even when trapped in wrong. I get it now. I understand. Winter came again, the second since his father's death. Gunny declined rapidly, her arthritis severe, her breathing labored. The vet was gentle but clear. She was suffering. It was time. James held her as the injection took effect, feeling her relax into sleep and then beyond. Another loss, another goodbye. But he'd had 14 years with her. That was something. He buried her on the ridge where she'd love to sit and watch the valley. The ground was frozen, the digging hard. But he did it himself. Some rituals required personal effort. Standing over the grave, he thought about all the deaths he'd witnessed. His son in Afghanistan, his wife from cancer, his father in Thailand. Now Gunny, the accumulation of loss that came with living long enough. But loss was the price of love, the cost of connection, and he would pay it again if given the choice, because the alternative was isolation, and isolation was a different kind of death. He adopted another dog a month later, a young German shepherd from a shelter. Named her Charlie, after his wife's father. She was rambunctious and undisciplined and full of life. She reminded him that beginnings mattered as much as endings. Spring returned, the cycle continuing. James was 69 now, old enough to qualify for senior discounts, but not old enough to feel finished. The protocol kept him engaged, gave him purpose beyond chopping wood and watching seasons change. He received a message that made him smile. Thomas Kowalski's granddaughter had joined the Army, inspired by stories of her grandfather's service. She was heading to intelligence school, wanted to work in analysis rather than field operations. Smart choice. Raymond's granddaughter, Sarah, had gotten accepted to veterinary school. Samuel was teaching young pilots at the local flight school, passing on knowledge earned through decades in cockpits. Chen's wife had passed peacefully, her memory intact enough at the end to recognize her husband and tell him she loved him. Life continued, the protocol continued, the work continued. One June morning, James received an unexpected package. Inside was a letter from the Secretary of the Army and a document, Colonel Hartigan. After extensive review, the Army has determined that Lieutenant David Hartigan's service merits inclusion in the classified honor roll of intelligence personnel who served with distinction during the Cold War. While the specifics of his contributions must remain secret, his name will be inscribed on a memorial accessible to those with appropriate clearances. Additionally, we are pleased to inform you that his personnel file has been permanently sealed with full honors notation. He is remembered as he deserved. James read the letter 3 times. Full honors, permanently sealed, remembered as he deserved. It wasn't perfect. The truth would remain hidden from most of the world. But the people who mattered knew. The institution acknowledged it. That had to be enough. He called his team, sharing the news. They celebrated quietly, each in their own way. No party, no ceremony, just the quiet satisfaction of a promise fully kept. That evening, James stood on his porch with Charlie at his feet, watching sunset paint the mountains in gold and purple. His phone buzzed, a message in the protocol channel. General Samuel Washington here. I'm putting together a small gathering in Wyoming next month. Just us. No agenda, no missions. Just old soldiers sharing a meal and swapping lies. You in? James smiled and typed, wouldn't miss it. A month later, they gathered at Samuel's ranch. 5 old men who had fought together in jungles and mountains in political labyrinths. Raymond, Samuel, Thomas, David Chen, and James. They cooked steaks over an open fire, drank whiskey that was too expensive for the occasion, but perfect anyway, and talked until stars filled the Wyoming sky. Samuel raised his glass. To David Hartigan, who taught us that honor doesn't require perfection, just commitment to doing better. They drank to that. Raymond added, to this protocol, may it continue long after we're gone. Thomas, to the truth, complicated and difficult and necessary. Chen, to family, both blood and chosen. James looked at these men, his brothers not by birth but by shared experience and mutual respect. They had saved each other's lives. They had honored a promise when it would have been easier to walk away. They had built something that would outlast them all. To us, he said simply, and to everyone still fighting in shadows, hoping for light. The next morning, Samuel took them flying in his Cessna. They soared over Wyoming at 8,000 feet, looking down at a landscape that stretched to horizons beyond sight. From up here, human concerns seemed small. The mountains didn't care about networks or protocols or moral complexities. They just existed, patient and eternal. But James realized that was the point. The mountains would outlast everything human. What mattered was how you spent the brief time between birth and death. Whether you kept promises, whether you told truth, whether you fought for what mattered even when fighting was hard. His father had done that, imperfectly but genuinely. James had done the same. The protocol would continue doing it long after they were all gone. As the plane banked toward home, James looked at his reflection in the window. 69 years old, gray hair, lines around the eyes. An old man by most measures, but he didn't feel old. He felt useful, connected, part of something larger than himself. The protocol was complete in the sense that his father was home, the promise kept, the mission accomplished. But it was also continuing, evolving, becoming something new with each case they handled and each person they helped. That was legacy, not medals or monuments, but living systems that adapted and persisted. Ideas that outlived the people who conceived them. Back at the ranch, they said their goodbyes. No promises to reunite, because they all understood that age made such promises dangerous. But the understanding between them was clear. The channel would remain open, the protocol would continue, and if any of them needed help, the others would answer. James drove back to Montana through mountain passes showing the first hints of autumn color. Charlie rode in the passenger seat, her head out the window, enjoying sensations that required no analysis or complication. At the cabin, he found an encrypted email from Hayes. She had attached a document, heavily redacted but readable. Your father's final assessment. He wrote this 2 months before he died. I thought you should have it. James opened the attachment, his father's handwriting, shaky but legible. To whoever reads this after I'm gone, I spent 50 years trying to justify choices made in a moment of weakness. I told myself I was doing good with bad circumstances, that I was preventing escalations, that my intelligence saved lives even while I betrayed my country. Some of that was true. Most of it was rationalization. The truth is simpler. I was afraid to die in that cell. Everything after that fear was just me trying to live with having been afraid. But I also learned something in 50 years of shadow work. Truth matters more than comfort. Transparency is worth the cost. And secrets, no matter how necessary they seem, eventually corrupt everything they touch. If I've contributed anything to my country, it's not the intelligence I provided to multiple masters. It's the documentation I kept, the evidence that will outlive me, the truth that others can use to prevent future networks from operating in the same darkness. I failed as a father, failed as a soldier, failed by any simple measure of honor. But maybe I succeeded in one small thing. I created a record. I called in the protocol, and I brought truth to light before I died. If that's enough, I'll accept it. If it's not, I'll accept that too. My son James has every right to hate me, but I hope he understands that complexity doesn't erase love. That failure doesn't mean absence of trying. That the man who betrayed his country and the man who loved his son were the same person, struggling with contradictions until the end. To the men who answered the protocol, thank you. You kept a promise that had no enforcement except honor. That means everything. To everyone who serves in shadows, document what you do. Create accountability. Don't let fear or expediency justify permanent darkness. Transparency is how democracy survives. I'm 85 years old, dying from chemical exposure earned in conflicts most people have forgotten. I have weeks left, maybe days. But I'm going home. That's more than I deserve and exactly what I needed. David Michael Hartigan, Lieutenant, United States Army Asset Pyramid 6, deceased. James read the document 3 times, tears streaming down his face. His father's final words, a mixture of confession and wisdom and hope. He saved the document to the protocol database, where it would live alongside the other testimonies and lessons learned. Future generations would read it and understand that service was complicated, that honor existed in shadows, that truth mattered even when it was painful. That night, James slept deeply for the first time in months, his dreams populated not by guilt or questions, but by simple images. His father teaching him to fish, walking together through autumn woods, sitting on this very porch watching sunset paint the mountains. When he woke, morning light streamed through the window, and Charlie was nosing his hand, ready for breakfast and a walk. The routines of life asserting themselves. James made coffee and stood on the porch, breathing cold air that clarified his thoughts. The protocol was complete. His father was home. The truth was documented. Justice, imperfect but real, had been served. What remained was living. Not just surviving or enduring, but actually engaging with the world in ways that brought meaning and connection. He called Samuel. I've been thinking about your proposal, about making the protocol permanent. And I'm in. But we do it right, not as operators, but as advisors. We're the counsel that younger people consult when they face impossible choices. We're the reminder that service is complicated and honor exists in shadows. Samuel's voice carried satisfaction. I was hoping you'd say that. I've already been talking to people, building the framework. We'll need your input on how to structure it. They spent an hour discussing logistics and principles, building the foundation for something that might outlive them all. After hanging up, James felt lighter, as if accepting this role had released him from something he didn't know he was carrying. The last protocol had been completed, but protocols by their nature were frameworks for future action, templates that could be adapted to new circumstances while maintaining core principles. His father's protocol had been about rescue and redemption. This new protocol would be about guidance and wisdom, about ensuring that people facing impossible choices had access to those who had walked similar paths. It wouldn't be perfect, nothing involving humans ever was, but it would be honest and principled and committed to truth over expedience. That had to be enough. James walked to the ridge one final time that year, Charlie bounding ahead through grass that would soon be covered in snow. They reached the top and looked out over the valley, at the landscape that had witnessed so much history and would witness much more. Thank you, Dad, for the lessons, for the complexity, for showing me that honor doesn't require perfection, just commitment to doing better. For bringing me into this work that matters. The wind carried his words away, scattering them like ashes, like promises, like all the things that mattered dispersing into the world to take root where they might. James turned and walked back to his cabin, to his life, to the work that remained. The protocol was complete. The mission was over. But the story, like all good stories, would continue in new forms with new characters facing timeless dilemmas. And somewhere in encrypted channels and quiet conversations, in lessons passed from one generation to the next, David Hartigan's complicated legacy would endure. Not as simple heroism or shameful betrayal, but as the truth it had always been. A man doing his best in impossible circumstances, making mistakes and finding redemption, serving in shadows while hoping for light. That was enough. That would always be enough. The last protocol had been honored, the promise kept, the circle closed. Everything else was just life, waiting to be lived. Years from now, when James was gone and others carried the protocol forward, they would tell the story differently. Some details would be lost, others embellished, but the core would remain. That a father and son separated by 50 years and impossible choices had found their way back to each other. That promises made by young men in jungles and mountains remain binding on old men who refuse to forget. That truth mattered more than comfort, and honor could exist in complicated places. The protocol would evolve. New cases would come, new challenges would arise, but the foundation was solid. James Hartigan had kept his father's protocol, and in doing so, he had created something larger. A living tradition of helping people close circles, tell truths, and come home before time made it impossible. The mountains stood witness, as they always had. The seasons turned, as they always would. And old warriors found rest, knowing their work would continue through others who understood that some promises never expire. The last light faded from the Montana sky. Stars emerged, those eternal witnesses to human struggle and triumph. And in a cabin nestled among pines, an old soldier sat by his fire with a young dog at his feet, content with the knowledge that he had done what needed doing. The protocol lived on. The mission continued, and that was enough.